In the dying light of a Montana winter, a woman stumbled off the afternoon stage with blood crusted beneath her fingernails and terror written across her face. Before the dust settled, she collapsed into the arms of the one man in Black Hollow who understood what it meant to survive hell, a widowed rancher named Garrett Hale, who'd learned long ago that some battles you don't walk away from. The letter clutched in her trembling hand warned that powerful men were already coming for her, and the choice Garrett made in front of the entire town that day would ignite a war against wealth, corruption, and a violence so deep it had nearly destroyed her. This is a story about two broken people who found something worth fighting for, even if it killed them both. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. The stagecoach was 3 hours late pulling into Black Hollow, and by the time it lurched to a stop in front of Whitmore's restaurant, the November cold had settled into the kind of bitter chill that made your bones ache. Garrett Hale stood on the boardwalk with his hat pulled low, waiting for a shipment of fence wire that probably wasn't coming. He'd learned not to expect much from the twice-weekly stage. Packages got lost, drivers got drunk, and the whole operation ran on Montana time, which meant whenever the hell it felt like arriving. The driver climbed down first, moving stiff like a man who'd been rattled over frozen roads for 6 straight hours. Then the door opened. She came out slow, gripping the frame like she didn't trust her legs to hold her. Garrett noticed the way she moved before he saw her face, careful, measured, like someone who'd learned to make herself small. When she stepped into the light, he felt something cold settle in his chest. The woman was maybe 25, dressed in a dark traveling coat that had seen better days. Her brown hair was pulled back severe, and her face was pale in a way that had nothing to do with the cold, but it was her eyes that stopped him. They were the eyes of someone who'd been running for a long time and knew the thing chasing her was getting closer. She took 2 steps toward the boardwalk, and her knees buckled. Garrett moved without thinking. He caught her before she hit the ground, one arm around her back, and that's when he felt her whole body go rigid with panic. She tried to pull away, a small sound escaping her throat that wasn't quite a scream. "Easy," he said, keeping his voice low. "You're all right. I got you." She looked up at him then, really looked, and he saw the calculation happening behind her eyes, measuring threat, weighing options, deciding whether to fight or run. Her right hand moved toward her coat pocket. "I'm just keeping you from cracking your head open," Garrett said, still not letting go but not tightening his grip either. "That's all." The stage driver had stopped pretending to unload luggage. Ada Whitmore stepped out of her restaurant, wiping her hands on her apron. A few townspeople slowed their walking, trying not to stare but staring anyway. The woman in Garrett's arms was breathing too fast, her chest rising and falling like she'd been running. Up close, he could see the bruise on her left cheekbone that she'd tried to powder over, the split in her lower lip that was healing crooked, the way her collar sat high and tight around her neck, hiding something. "I can stand," she said, and her voice came out steadier than he expected. He let her go careful, making sure she had her balance before stepping back. She swayed once, caught herself, and pulled her coat tighter. That's when the letter fell out of her pocket and landed in the dirt between them. They both looked at it. The envelope was expensive paper, the kind that came from back east. It had been opened and folded too many times, the creases starting to tear. She bent to pick it up, wincing like the movement hurt, and Garrett saw her wrist. The bruise there was old, faded to yellow-green, and it wrapped all the way around like someone had grabbed her and held on too long. "You got somewhere to go?" he asked. She looked at him like he'd asked a trick question. "I have lodging arranged." "Where?" "The hotel." Garrett glanced down the street. Black Hollow had one hotel, and calling it that was generous. The McCreary place was 3 rooms above a failing dry goods store, and old Mrs. McCreary hadn't changed the sheets since her husband died 2 years back. "That place is a fire waiting to happen," he said. "Chimney smoke so bad you'll choke all night." "I'll manage." "I'm sure you will, but there's better options." She studied him again, that same weighing look. "You're very kind, but—" "I'm not kind," Garrett interrupted. "I run a ranch 8 miles out, got a spare room, door locks from the inside, and I mind my own business." Ada had moved closer now, pretending to sweep the boardwalk. The stage driver had given up all pretense and was openly listening. "Why would you do that?" the woman asked. It was a fair question. Garrett looked at her, really looked, and saw someone who'd been hurt so many times she'd stopped believing in accidents of kindness. He recognized it because he'd seen the same thing in the mirror after Sarah died. "Because you look like you could use a night where you're not watching the door," he said. Something shifted in her expression. Not trust exactly, but maybe the shadow of what trust used to feel like. "My name is Vivian Mercer," she said quietly. "Garrett Hale." She nodded once, formal. "If the offer is genuine, Mr. Hale, I accept." 20 minutes later, they were riding out of town in Garrett's wagon, Vivian's single carpet bag wedged between them. She sat rigid on the bench, hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead like she was being transported to her own execution. "Been traveling long?" Garrett asked. 3 weeks. "Coming from?" "Boston." She said it flat, like the word tasted bad. "Long way." "Yes." They rode in silence for a while. The road wound through scrub pine and open grassland, climbing gradually toward the mountains that ringed the valley. The sun was dropping fast, turning everything gold and then red and then purple. "You have family out here?" Garrett tried again. "No." "Friends?" "No." "Job waiting?" Vivian turned to look at him then, and there was something sharp in her expression. "Are you always this curious about strangers, Mr. Hale? Only when they show up looking like they've been through a war." She looked away again. "Perhaps I have." It was full dark by the time they reached the ranch. Garrett's place wasn't much, a main house that had been added onto in stages over 20 years, a barn that needed new shingles, corrals that needed mending, and about 200 acres of land that fought him every season. But it was his, and it was quiet, and after Sarah died, that quiet had been the only thing keeping him sane. He pulled the wagon up to the house and climbed down, then offered Vivian a hand. She took it briefly, her fingers ice cold, and stepped down on her own. Inside the house was cold. Garrett lit the lamps and got the stove going while Vivian stood in the middle of the front room looking like she was cataloging exits. "Spare room's through there," he said, pointing to a door off the main room. "I'll get a fire started. There's water in the pitcher and clean blankets in the chest." She didn't move. "Vivian," he said, keeping his voice even, "the door's got a bolt on the inside. Use it. I sleep in the loft and I'm a heavy sleeper. You won't see me till morning unless the barn catches fire." "Why are you helping me?" It was the second time she'd asked, and Garrett figured she'd keep asking until she got an answer that made sense to her. Problem was, he wasn't sure he had one. "My wife died 2 years ago," he said, finally. "Fever took her in 3 days. Afterward, people kept showing up with food and offers to help, and I told every one of them to leave me alone. Then one day the miller's wife showed up and didn't ask, just cleaned the house and left. Came back the next week and did it again. Took me a month to realize she wasn't helping because she wanted something. She was helping because she saw a man who was drowning and she had a rope." Vivian's hands had tightened on her carpet bag. "I'm not drowning." "No," Garrett agreed. "You're running. That's different, but the rope works the same way." She stood there a moment longer, and he could see her trying to decide whether to believe him. Finally, she nodded and walked to the spare room, closing the door behind her. A second later, he heard the bolt slide home with a solid click. Garrett made coffee and sat at the table, listening to the house settle. After a while, he heard water running in the basin, then quiet. He gave it another hour before banking the stove and climbing the ladder to the loft. He didn't sleep well. Kept listening for sounds from downstairs, footsteps, the door opening, signs that she'd decided to run after all. Around 3 in the morning, he heard her cry out, then go silent. He stayed where he was. Whatever nightmare she was fighting it alone. When he came down at first light, the spare room door was still closed. He got the stove going, made breakfast, and was pouring coffee when she emerged. She'd changed clothes, a plain gray dress buttoned to the throat, and pulled her hair back so tight it looked painful. The bruise on her face stood out worse in the morning light. "Coffee's hot," Garrett said. "Thank you." She sat at the table but didn't reach for the cup he poured her. "Mr. Hale, I need to be clear about something." "All right. I can't pay you for the room. Not yet. I have some funds, but they're tied up in a legal matter. It may be weeks before—" "Don't worry about it. I'm not a charity case." "Didn't say you were." "Then what do you want from me?" Garrett set down his coffee. "I want you to eat breakfast and tell me if you take sugar. That's it. Everything else we'll figure out as we go." She stared at him like he was speaking a different language. Finally, she said, "No sugar." "All right then." They ate in silence. Vivian picked at her food, managing about half of what he'd given her. When she was done, she stood and started clearing plates. "You don't have to do that," Garrett said. "I'm not sitting idle." "Suit yourself." She washed the dishes with quick, efficient movements, and Garrett noticed the way she kept her back to the wall, positioning herself so she could see the door and the window at the same time. When she was done, she dried her hands and turned to face him. "I should explain why I'm here. Only if you want to." "I don't want to, but you deserve to know what you've invited into your home." Garrett leaned back in his chair and waited. Vivian took a breath. "I have a half-brother. His name is Victor Mercer. He's wealthy, connected, and very, very dangerous. When our father died 5 years ago, Victor became my legal guardian despite the fact that I was 20 years old. He controlled my inheritance, controlled where I lived, who I spoke to, what I wore. If I disobeyed him, he—" She stopped, her hand moving unconsciously to her wrist. "He hurt you," Garrett finished quietly. "Yes, for 5 years. And 3 weeks ago, I finally ran." "Good." The simple affirmation seemed to surprise her. "Victor has resources, Mr. Hale. He's already looking for me. When he finds out I came west, he'll follow. And when he gets here, there will be trouble, legal trouble. He's convinced a judge back in Boston that I'm mentally unstable. He has paperwork declaring him my permanent guardian. If he finds me, he can force me back." "Not if you don't want to go. The law doesn't care what I want." "Then the law's broken." Vivian almost smiled at that, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I can't involve you in this. It's not fair." "Life's not fair. People like your brother count on folks being too scared to do what's right. I stopped being scared of much when Sarah died." "You don't understand what he's capable of." "Maybe not, but I understand what you're capable of. You ran. That takes spine. So here's what we're going to do. You're going to stay here long as you need. Rest up. Figure out your next move. Meanwhile, I've got ranch work that needs doing and winter coming hard. If you want to help out, fine. If you want to keep to yourself, that's fine too. But you're safe here. That's not negotiable." She looked at him for a long moment, and Garrett could see her trying to process the idea that someone might help her without expecting something in return. "Why?" she asked again, softer this time. "Because 5 years ago, when Sarah got sick, I couldn't save her. Couldn't do a damn thing but watch her die. So when I see someone I might actually be able to help, I'm going to do it. That's all the reason I need." Vivian's eyes went bright and she turned away quickly. "Thank you," she said, her voice rough. "I don't know what else to say except thank you. Don't need anything else." The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Garrett worked the ranch, mending fences, feeding livestock, cutting firewood for the winter. Vivian kept to herself mostly, but she didn't hide in her room. She cleaned the house methodically, reorganized the kitchen, and started working on the garden plot that Sarah had planted years ago and that Garrett had let go to weeds. She didn't talk much. Sometimes Garrett would come in for lunch and find her sitting at the table with that creased letter in her hands, reading it over and over like she was trying to memorize something. Other times he'd see her standing at the window, watching the road with the kind of vigilance that came from expecting bad news. On the 4th day, Garrett found her in the barn. She'd swept the whole thing clean and was organizing the tack when he came in from checking the north pasture. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I know, but I need to be useful." "You all right?" She hung a bridle on its hook, her movements precise. "I keep thinking about what you said, about Sarah, about not being able to save her." "Yeah? I spent 5 years letting Victor convince me I was helpless, that I deserved what he did to me, that if I just tried harder to be good, to be perfect, he'd stop." She turned to face Garrett. "But he never stopped. And the moment I realized that, the moment I understood that nothing I did would ever be enough, something broke in me. Or maybe something fixed itself. I stopped trying to be perfect and started planning to run." "How'd you get away?" Victor travels frequently. Business trips, gambling circuits, social obligations. 3 weeks ago, he left for New York, and his man was careless with the keys. I took what cash I could carry, burned my guardianship papers in the study fireplace, and walked out the front door. "The letter?" Vivian pulled it from her pocket, unfolding it carefully. "This arrived 2 days before I left. It's from Victor's lawyer. It outlines his plan to have me institutionalized permanently. Apparently, my hysteria had become too difficult to manage at home. Garrett felt anger rise hot in his chest. He was going to lock you up. Yes. In an asylum where no one would listen to anything I said, where I'd disappear completely. She refolded the letter. So I made a choice. I could stay and let him erase me, or I could run and become someone else, someone he couldn't find. You came to Montana Territory. I came to the one place I thought he'd never look. Victor hates the frontier, calls it barbaric. But I researched towns, followed railroad lines west, and chose Black Hollow because it was small enough that I might disappear, but big enough that I could find work. What kind of work? I can sew. Before our father died, I apprenticed with a dressmaker. I'm good with my hands, and I thought perhaps I could find employment here. Garrett nodded slowly. Ada Whitmore's always looking for help at the restaurant, and there's a seamstress in town, Mrs. Chen. Does alterations, makes clothes for folks who can pay. She might could use an assistant. You think she'd hire me? I think if you can do the work, she won't ask too many questions. People come west to get away from something. That's half the population out here. For the first time since she'd arrived, Vivian looked almost hopeful. I'd like to try. They went into town 2 days later. Garrett introduced Vivian to Ada first, and the restaurant owner took one look at her and immediately pulled her into the kitchen for coffee. Ada was a force of nature, 60 years old, built like a fence post, and meaner than a rattlesnake when riled. She'd buried 2 husbands and outlasted 3 business partners, and she didn't suffer fools. Garrett says you're looking for work, Ada said, pouring coffee so strong it could strip paint. Yes, ma'am. You got references? No, ma'am. Skills? I can sew, cook, and keep books. I'm a hard worker and I don't cause trouble. Ada studied her with sharp eyes. You running from something? Vivian met her gaze steady. Yes. Husband? Brother. He follow you out here? He might. Ada nodded like this was the most reasonable thing in the world. All right then, you can start tomorrow. I need help during lunch and dinner rushes. Pays fair, and I feed you while you work. You give me trouble or steal from me, Garrett answers for it. I won't give you trouble. See that you don't. Ada refilled her coffee. And Vivian? Men who chase women cross-country don't stop easy. You need help when he shows up, you come find me. I've dealt with worse than some Boston fancy boy. After Ada's, they walked down to Mrs. Chen's dress shop. The seamstress was a tiny Chinese woman who'd come west during the railroad boom and stayed when her husband died in a mining accident. She ran the best dress shop in 3 counties, and her prices reflected it. I'm not hiring, Mrs. Chen said when Garrett explained why they'd come. Just hear her out, Garrett said. Mrs. Chen looked at Vivian. Show me your hands. Vivian held them out. Mrs. Chen examined them carefully. The calluses, the needle scars, the way her fingers were slightly crooked from years of close work. You know good stitching from bad? Yes, ma'am. French seams? Yes. Buttonholes? I can do them blind. Mrs. Chen almost smiled. There's a bolt of green silk in the back room. Make me a sleeve. You have 1 hour. Vivian disappeared into the back. Garrett waited, drinking tea Mrs. Chen poured without asking if he wanted any. 45 minutes later, Vivian returned with a perfectly constructed sleeve, seams invisible, the drape flawless. Mrs. Chen examined it front and back, held it to the light, tugged at the stitches. You'll work Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, she said. 4 hours each day. I pay by the piece, and I don't accept sloppy work. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. On the ride back to the ranch, Vivian was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. She looked out at the mountains, at the big sky turning orange with sunset, and something in her posture had changed. You did good today, Garrett said. I have a job. 2 jobs. I can start saving money. That's right. And when I have enough, I can find my own place. I won't be a burden on you forever. Garrett glanced at her. You're not a burden now. Still, I appreciate what you've done, Mr. Hale, more than I can say. Garrett's fine, and you're welcome. That night, for the first time, Vivian didn't bolt her bedroom door. Garrett didn't comment on it, but he noticed. The weeks rolled forward. November turned to December. Snow came early and stayed late, blanketing the valley in white. Vivian settled into her work at both the restaurant and the dress shop, and Garrett watched her slowly come back to life. She laughed one afternoon when one of Ada's regular customers told a terrible joke. The sound startled both of them, Vivian's hand flying to her mouth like she'd done something wrong, Garrett nearly dropping the coffee he was refilling. But then she laughed again, and it was easier the second time. She started asking questions about the ranch. How many head of cattle did Garrett run? Why did he plant wheat in the south field instead of corn? What was that bird she kept seeing by the creek? Garrett answered everything, and sometimes she'd follow him out to the barn just to keep talking. One evening in mid-December, Garrett came in from feeding the horses and found Vivian standing in the kitchen with flour in her hair and disaster spread across the counter. I was trying to make biscuits, she said, looking embarrassed. Victor never let me near the kitchen. Said a woman of my station didn't need to know such things, but I wanted to learn, and I thought I could figure it out from your cookbook. But she gestured helplessly at the dough that looked more like cement. Garrett bit back a smile. Let me show you. They made biscuits together, Garrett walking her through each step. Her hands were shaking at first, but she watched everything he did with fierce concentration. When they finally pulled the pan from the oven, the biscuits were lopsided and slightly burnt, but they were edible. I did it, Vivian said, and she sounded amazed. You did. Victor would have... She stopped herself, shaking her head. It doesn't matter what Victor would have done. I made biscuits. They ate dinner at the table, and Vivian talked more than Garrett had ever heard her talk. About the dress she was making for Mrs. Chen's customer. About the new dessert Ada was testing at the restaurant. About the December sky and how different the stars looked out here compared to Boston. Garrett listened, watching her face come alive with the telling, and felt something shift in his chest. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was the beginning of something that might grow into it. That night, sleeping in the loft, he thought about Sarah, about the promise he'd made to her in those last fevered hours, that he'd keep living, keep working the ranch, keep putting one foot in front of the other. He'd kept that promise, but it had been hollow survival, just existing without any real purpose beyond making it to the next day. Vivian had changed that. Not by trying to replace Sarah, nothing could do that, but by reminding him that there were still people worth protecting, still reasons to give a damn. He fell asleep thinking about how he was going to fix the south fence before the real winter storms hit. And for the first time in 2 years, he was already looking forward to morning. 3 days before Christmas, everything changed. Garrett had ridden into town for supplies, leaving Vivian at the ranch with a list of small repairs to tackle if she felt like it. She'd taken to maintaining the house with the same fierce precision she brought to everything else, and he'd stopped trying to tell her she didn't have to. He was loading fence posts into the wagon when he saw the stranger. The man was standing outside the hotel, dressed too fine for Black Hollow. Tailored coat, polished boots, a gold watch chain visible across his vest. He was talking to old Mrs. McCreary, showing her something that looked like a photograph. Garrett's gut tightened. He finished loading the wagon and walked over to Ada's, where he found her in the kitchen cutting vegetables for the dinner rush. There's a man asking questions at the hotel, he said quietly. Fancy dresser, showing around a photograph. Ada's knife didn't slow. Description? Tall, dark hair, maybe 40. Moves like money. That'd be Victor Mercer. Garrett felt ice slide down his spine. You sure? June Hale came by an hour ago. Said a man matching that description checked into the hotel this morning and has been asking everyone in town if they've seen his poor, sick sister who ran away from Boston. Got himself real tearful about it, too. Said she's not right in the head and he's just trying to bring her home safe. Damn. My thoughts exactly. Ada pointed her knife at him. Vivian know he's here? Not unless someone rode out to tell her. Then you better get moving. That bastard's going to come looking for her, and when he does, she needs to be ready. Garrett drove the wagon harder than he should have, the horses laboring through the snow-packed road. By the time he pulled up to the ranch house, the sun was dropping fast and his hands were numb on the reins. Vivian was in the garden, of all places, clearing dead plants from the beds, even though it was freezing. She looked up when she heard the wagon and smiled, then saw his face and the smile died. What's wrong? Victor's in town. The color drained from her face. She dropped the dead stalks she was holding and gripped the fence post for balance. You're sure? Ada identified him. He's been showing your photograph around, telling folks you're unstable and he's trying to bring you home. What did they tell him? Ada didn't say. But Black Hollow's a small town, Vivian. If he asks enough people, someone's going to mention the woman working at the restaurant and the dress shop. Someone's going to point him this direction. She was breathing too fast again, the same panicked rhythm from the day she'd arrived. I have to run. I'll pack my things and… No. Garrett, you don't understand. If he finds me here, if he knows I've been staying with you, he'll destroy you. He'll use the law. He'll ruin your reputation. He'll… Let him try. You can't fight him. He has lawyers, judges, connections. And I have a ranch, a rifle, and a stubborn streak that outlasted 2 Montana winters. Victor Mercer doesn't scare me. Vivian was shaking her head. You don't know what he's like. You don't know the things he's capable of. Garrett stepped close enough to take her shoulders, gentle but firm. Then tell me, right now. Tell me everything, and we'll figure out what to do together. She looked up at him, and in the fading light he could see the war happening behind her eyes, the part of her that had learned not to trust fighting against the part that desperately wanted to. He'll have papers, she said finally, her voice breaking. Legal documents declaring him my guardian. A doctor's statement saying I'm mentally unfit. He's been building this case for years, Garrett. Every time I disobeyed him, every time I showed the slightest bit of independence, he documented it as evidence of instability. If he gets me in front of a judge, I'll lose. Not if we fight back. With what? I have nothing. No proof of what he did to me, no witnesses who'll speak against him, no money for lawyers. You have me. The words hung between them. Vivian stared at him like he'd offered her something impossible. Why would you do this? She whispered. Why would you risk everything for me? Garrett didn't have a good answer. Couldn't explain the feeling that had been growing in his chest for weeks now. The sense that Vivian Mercer showing up on that stagecoach had been something more than accident. That protecting her wasn't charity or obligation, but something deeper and more necessary. So instead of trying to explain, he just told her the truth. Because you matter, he said. And I'm done watching people I care about get hurt when I could have stopped it. Vivian's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment Garrett thought she might collapse again like she had that first day. But then she straightened, wiped her face with rough hands, and nodded. All right, she said. Then we fight. They spent that night planning like generals before a battle. Garrett built up the fire while Vivian spread out everything she had on the kitchen table. The crumpled letter from Victor's lawyer, a few other documents she'd managed to steal before running, and a small leather journal she pulled from the bottom of her carpet bag. What's that? Garrett asked, nodding at the journal. Vivian's hands tightened on it. A record. I started keeping it 2 years ago after Victor broke my wrist the first time. I documented everything. Dates, injuries, what he said, what he did. I thought maybe someday I could use it as evidence, but then I realized no judge would believe me over him. Can I see it? She hesitated, then pushed it across the table. Garrett opened it carefully. The handwriting was small and precise, each entry dated and numbered. He read 3 pages and had to stop, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. This is good, he said, his voice rough. This is evidence. It's the word of a woman Victor claims is unstable. His doctors will say I invented it all, that the injuries were accidents or self-inflicted. Then we get our own doctor to examine you, document the scars, the old breaks, everything that matches what's written here. And who's going to believe a frontier doctor over a Boston specialist? People who've actually met you. People who've seen you work, seen you handle yourself. Ada, Mrs. Chen, everyone at the restaurant, they'll testify that you're sound of mind. Vivian shook her head. Victor will destroy their credibility. He's done it before. Anyone who speaks for me becomes a target. Garrett sat back, thinking. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows. The fire crackled in the stove. There's one thing that could stop him immediately, Garrett said slowly. One thing that would invalidate his guardianship claim without needing a judge to rule on your competency. What? Marriage. If you're married, he's no longer your legal guardian. Your husband becomes your next of kin. The silence that followed was heavy enough to break the floorboards. Vivian stared at him like he'd suggested she jump off a cliff. That's insane. It's practical. It's a different kind of prison, Garrett, trading one man's control for another's. I'm not talking about control. I'm talking about a legal arrangement that protects you from Victor. We sign papers, file them at the courthouse, and suddenly all his claims evaporate. And then what? We pretend to be married? Live some kind of lie? Or we make it real? The words came out before Garrett had fully thought them through, but once they were spoken, he realized he meant them. Vivian must have seen something in his face because she stood up abruptly, wrapping her arms around herself. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. We've known each other 6 weeks, Garrett. 6 weeks. You can't possibly... Can't possibly what? Care about you? Be willing to stand between you and a man who's been torturing you for 5 years? Because I hate to break it to you, but I already am. This isn't caring, it's pity. It's not pity either. Vivian turned away, her shoulders rigid. Then what is it? Garrett stood up, moving slowly so he wouldn't spook her. It's me being tired of watching good people get crushed by bastards with money and power. It's me having a ranch that's too damn quiet and a life that stopped meaning much when Sarah died. And it's me looking at you and seeing someone who fights even when the odds are impossible, and thinking maybe that's exactly the kind of person I want in my corner. She was shaking her head, but he could see her breathing had changed. Not panic this time, but something else. You'd be tied to me, she said. Legally, socially. You'd inherit all my problems. Victor won't just disappear if we marry. He'll come after you too. Let him. You don't understand what you'd be giving up. The freedom to find someone you actually love, to build the life you want. I had that life. I loved Sarah more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. And when she died, it took me 2 years to remember how to breathe without feeling like I was drowning. I'm not looking to replace her. That's not what this is. Then what is it? Garrett moved closer, close enough that he could see the pulse jumping in her throat. It's me asking if maybe we could both use a partner, someone to watch our backs when things get hard, someone who understands that life out here doesn't come with guarantees, just choices. And right now, the choice I'm making is to stand with you. The question is whether you'll stand with me. Vivian looked up at him, and in the lamplight he could see tears tracking down her face. I don't know how to be someone's wife. Victor made sure I never learned anything except how to be afraid. Then we'll figure it out together. No expectations. No obligations beyond keeping each other safe. We take it slow, we take it honest, and we don't let Victor Mercer dictate what your life looks like. She was quiet for a long time, her eyes searching his face like she was trying to read something written in a language she didn't quite speak. Finally, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and nodded. All right, she whispered. But Garrett, if this goes wrong, if Victor finds a way to hurt you because of me, I'll never forgive myself. Then we better make sure it doesn't go wrong. They didn't sleep much that night. Garrett stayed in the loft, listening to Vivian pace downstairs, and somewhere around 3 a.m. he heard her crying. He almost went down, but something told him she needed the privacy to fall apart where no one could see. By dawn they were both up, moving through morning chores with the exhausted focus of people who'd made a decision that couldn't be unmade. Garrett fed the horses while Vivian made coffee so strong it could wake the dead. We should go into town today, Garrett said. Talk to the sheriff, file the marriage license, make it official before Victor has a chance to move. He might already be watching the courthouse. Probably, but running won't help now. We face this head on or we spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders. Vivian nodded, but her hands were shaking as she pulled on her coat. They took the wagon into Black Hollow, and the whole ride in Garrett could feel her tension like a physical thing sitting between them. The town was busier than usual. Christmas was 2 days away and people were doing last-minute shopping, kids running wild in the street. Garrett pulled the wagon up in front of the sheriff's office and helped Vivian down. Sheriff Tom Burke was 50 years old, built like a barrel, and had the kind of face that suggested he'd seen everything twice and wasn't impressed either time. He looked up when they walked in, and his expression shifted to something careful. Garrett, Miss Mercer, Tom. Heard there's a gentleman in town looking for the young lady. Says she's his sister, needs to be taken back east for her own safety. That's not true, Vivian said quietly. Figured it might not be. Man's got papers, though. Legal documents from a judge in Massachusetts declaring him her legal guardian. Those papers are fraudulent, Vivian said. Victor forged the doctor's statements. I'm not unstable, I'm not a danger to myself, and I don't need a guardian. Burke leaned back in his chair. I believe you, Miss Mercer. Problem is, belief don't hold much weight against a court order. If this Victor Mercer shows up here with those documents and demands I turn you over, legally, I got no choice. There's one choice, Garrett said. Marriage. If Vivian marries me, his guardianship claim becomes void. Burke looked between them. That what you want, Miss Mercer? Yes. You sure? Because I've known Garrett Hale 20 years and he's a good man, but marriage is serious business. Once those papers are filed. I'm sure, Sheriff. Burke studied her for another moment, then nodded. All right, I'll witness the license. But you should know that Mercer's already been asking questions. He knows you've been working at Ada's and Mrs. Chen's. It's only a matter of time before someone tells him about Garrett's ranch. Let them tell him, Garrett said. By the time he figures out where to look, Vivian will be my wife, and there won't be a damn thing he can do about it. They walked to the courthouse together. The clerk who processed the marriage license was a nervous man named Patterson who kept glancing at Vivian like she might explode. He had them fill out the paperwork, collected the filing fee, and stamped everything with shaking hands. You'll need a witness for the ceremony, Patterson said, and someone to perform it. Judge Holloway usually handles civil ceremonies, but he's out of town until after Christmas. I can perform it, came a voice from the doorway. They all turned. Ada Whitmore stood there in her heavy coat, her gray hair escaping from under her hat. Behind her was Garrett's sister June, looking equally determined. Ada, Garrett said, I'm a notary public, have been for 15 years. I can legally perform marriages in this territory. She looked at Vivian. That is, if you'll have me. Vivian's eyes filled up. I'd be honored. Good. June will witness. Let's get this done before that Boston peacock shows up and ruins everything. They held the ceremony right there in the courthouse, standing in a shaft of winter sunlight that came through the tall windows. It wasn't fancy, no flowers, no music, no guests beyond the 4 people who needed to be there. But when Ada asked if Vivian took Garrett to be her husband, and Vivian said yes in a voice that only shook a little, Garrett felt something shift in his chest. When it was his turn, he looked at Vivian and said, I do, and meant every letter of it. Ada pronounced them married. June hugged Vivian hard enough to crack ribs. Patterson filed the papers with hands that had finally stopped shaking. And just like that, Vivian Mercer became Vivian Hale. They were walking out of the courthouse when Victor found them. He was standing on the steps, blocking their path. And Garrett's first thought was that the man looked exactly like someone who'd spent his whole life having doors opened for him. Tall and well-dressed, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and the kind of handsome face that probably charmed judges and intimidated servants. But his eyes were cold, and when he looked at Vivian, Garrett saw something predatory flicker across his expression. There you are, sister, Victor said, his voice smooth as oil. I've been so worried about you. Vivian stopped like she'd hit a wall. All the color drained from her face, and Garrett felt her start to tremble. He moved closer, putting himself slightly in front of her. We're leaving, Garrett said. Victor's attention shifted to him, and those cold eyes narrowed. And you are? Garrett Hale, Vivian's husband. The smile on Victor's face didn't waver, but something dangerous flashed in his expression. I'm sorry. I think I misheard you. Did you say husband? You heard right. We were married 10 minutes ago. Paperwork's filed at the courthouse if you want to check. Victor looked past Garrett to Vivian, and his voice went soft in a way that made Garrett's skin crawl. Vivian, darling, what have you done? I married him, Victor. Her voice came out steadier than Garrett expected. I'm not your ward anymore. I'm not anything to you anymore. You're my sister. You're sick. And this man has clearly taken advantage of your condition. The only person who's taken advantage of her is you, Garrett said flatly. And that's done now. So you can get on the next stage back to Boston, or you can stay in Black Hollow and watch her build a life you got no part of. Your choice. Victor's smile finally dropped. He descended the steps slowly, and Garrett noticed he moved like a man who was used to physical confrontation, balanced, careful, looking for openings. I have legal documents, Victor said. A guardianship order signed by a Massachusetts judge. It declares Vivian mentally incompetent and grants me permanent custody of her person and her estate. Had documents, Garrett corrected. Past tense. Because the moment she married me, your guardianship became invalid. She's not your ward, she's my wife, And if you want to challenge that, you'll need to convince a Montana judge that a woman who's been holding down 2 jobs and managing her own affairs is somehow incompetent. Good luck with that. Victor's jaw tightened. He looked at Vivian again, and this time his voice dropped to something sharp and mean. You think marrying some dirt farmer changes anything? You think I won't fight this? I'll have this marriage annulled before the week is out. I'll prove you were coerced, that you weren't of sound mind when you signed those papers. Try it, Vivian said, and her voice had changed, less afraid now, more angry. Go ahead and drag this into court, Victor. Let's get a Montana judge to look at my so-called incompetence. Let's get doctors out here to examine me and compare their findings to your fabricated medical reports. Let's put everything on the record. You have no idea what you're doing, Victor hissed. I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm calling your bluff. For a moment, Garrett thought Victor might actually swing at her. The man's hands were clenched at his sides, his breathing controlled but angry. But they were on a public street with people watching, and whatever else Victor Mercer was, he was smart enough not to show his true face in front of witnesses. This isn't over, Victor said quietly. Not even close. He turned and walked away, his expensive boots clicking on the frozen ground. Garrett watched him go, memorizing the set of his shoulders, the way he moved. This was a man who'd been in fights before. Maybe not physical ones, but the kind of fights that destroyed reputations and ruined lives. He meant it, Vivian said softly. About this not being over. I know. Garrett, I'm sorry. I should have warned you that he wouldn't just accept it. Stop apologizing. You didn't create this mess, he did, and we're going to end it. June appeared at Garrett's elbow, her face tight with worry. That was Victor? Yeah. He looked like he wanted to kill someone. Probably did. Ada joined them, her expression dark. I don't like this, Garrett. That man's going to cause trouble. Let him try. I'm serious. Men like that, they don't fight fair. They use lawyers and money and connections. They find your weak spots and they press until you break. Garrett looked at Vivian, who was still staring after her brother with an expression that mixed fear and fury in equal measure. Then it's a good thing we don't break easy. They went to Ada's restaurant for a late lunch, mostly because none of them wanted to split up yet. The dining room was half full with the usual crowd, ranchers, miners, a few families doing Christmas shopping. Word of the marriage had already spread, and people kept glancing over at their table with poorly concealed curiosity. Vivian picked at her food, her appetite gone. Garrett tried to eat but found he wasn't much better. Only June managed to clear her plate, though she kept shooting worried looks at her brother. You should both come stay at my place for a few days, June said, just until we know what Victor's planning. We're not running, Garrett said. I'm not suggesting you run. I'm suggesting you be smart. That man looked like he wanted blood, and your ranch is 8 miles from town with no neighbors for 2 miles in any direction. If he decides to make trouble, then we'll handle it. Garrett, June, I appreciate the concern, but Vivian and I talked this through. We're staying at the ranch, we're living our lives, and we're not giving Victor Mercer the satisfaction of seeing us hide. June opened her mouth to argue, then closed it and shook her head. You're as stubborn as Pa ever was. Learn from the best. After lunch, they picked up supplies and headed back to the ranch. The ride was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. When they finally pulled up to the house, the sun was already dropping toward the mountains and the temperature was falling fast. Garrett unhitched the wagon and took care of the horses while Vivian went inside to get the fire going. By the time he came in, stamping snow off his boots, she had the stove roaring and coffee brewing. We should talk, she said. All right. They sat at the table, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Finally, Vivian said, I know we agreed this was a practical arrangement, a legal protection, but Garrett, we're married now. Actually married, and I need to know what that means to you. What do you want it to mean? I don't know. I've never had a choice before. Victor controlled everything, where I lived, what I wore, who I spoke to. And before him, our father was the same way. I've been someone's property since I was 15 years old. I don't know how to be anything else. You're not property now. You're a partner. What does that mean practically? Do you expect me to... She stopped, her face coloring. There are certain expectations in a marriage, certain obligations. Garrett realized what she was asking and felt his own face heat. Vivian, I'm not expecting anything from you that you're not ready to give. This marriage is real in the legal sense, but everything else, we take it at your pace. You want separate rooms? We have separate rooms. You want me to keep my distance? I keep my distance. The only thing I expect from you is honesty. You tell me what you need, and I'll do my best to provide it. That's the deal." She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her trying to process the idea that someone might actually mean what they said. "You're not like anyone I've ever known. I'm just a rancher who talks too much and makes terrible coffee." "You make fine coffee." She almost smiled. "Garrett, if we're going to make this work, if we're going to convince a judge that this marriage is real and not just a legal maneuver, we're going to need to act like a married couple, at least in public." "What does that look like?" "I don't know. But Victor's going to be watching, looking for any sign that this was a sham. If we're still living like strangers under one roof, he'll use that against us." Garrett thought about it. "So we make some changes. You move your things into the main bedroom. I stay in the loft for now, but we eat together, work together, go into town together. We let people see us building a life. And if Victor demands proof that the marriage was consummated, then we tell him to go to hell, because that's nobody's business but ours." Vivian smiled for real this time, small but genuine. "You make it sound simple." "It is simple. We just have to want it more than Victor wants to destroy it." They spent the rest of the evening rearranging the house. Vivian moved her few belongings into the main bedroom, while Garrett cleared out some of Sarah's things that he'd been unable to touch for 2 years. It felt strange and sad and necessary all at once. When they were done, the house looked different. Less like a shrine to the past, and more like a place where two people might actually build a future. That night, Vivian took the bedroom, and Garrett climbed to the loft as usual. But something had shifted between them. It wasn't love yet. Maybe it never would be. But it was the foundation of something that might be stronger than love. It was trust. Garrett fell asleep thinking about the look on Victor's face when he'd realized he'd lost control of his sister. The fury there had been real and dangerous, and Garrett knew they hadn't seen the last of it. He was right. The next morning, Christmas Eve, Garrett woke to pounding on the front door. He scrambled down from the loft, grabbing his rifle on the way, and found Sheriff Burke standing on the porch with snow on his hat and trouble written all over his face. "What's wrong?" Garrett asked. "Victor Mercer filed a complaint in town this morning. Says you coerced Vivian into marriage while she was in a diminished mental state. He's demanding a competency hearing." Vivian appeared from the bedroom, her face pale. "When?" "Judge Holloway gets back day after Christmas. Mercer's already got a lawyer arriving from Helena. They're pushing for an emergency hearing the day after that." "Can he do that?" Garrett asked. "He can try, and with the kind of money he's throwing around, he might succeed. I came out here to warn you both. This is about to get ugly." Vivian sank into a chair. "He's going to paint me as crazy. He'll bring in his doctors, present his fabricated evidence, and convince the judge I'm not capable of making my own decisions." "Then we fight fire with fire," Garrett said. "We get our own doctors. We bring in character witnesses. We show the judge exactly who Vivian is and what Victor's been doing to her." Burke nodded slowly. "That might work. But Garrett, you need to understand what you're up against. Mercer's not just rich, he's connected. He's already been talking to the mayor, the banker, anyone with influence in this town. He's building a case that you're a fortune hunter who saw an opportunity and took advantage of a vulnerable woman. That's horseshit. I know that. But a judge from Helena who doesn't know either of you, he might see things different. Then we make sure he sees the truth." Burke tipped his hat. "Good luck. You're going to need it." After the sheriff left, Garrett and Vivian sat at the table making lists. They needed doctors willing to examine Vivian and testify to her mental competency. They needed witnesses who could speak to her character and her ability to work and make decisions. They needed evidence that Victor's guardianship had been built on lies and violence. "Ada will testify," Vivian said, "and Mrs. Chen, maybe some of the customers at the restaurant. June will speak for us. And I can ask some of the other ranchers, men who've known me for years. Will that be enough?" It has to be. They spent Christmas Eve writing letters and visiting neighbors. Garrett rode to 3 different ranches, explaining the situation and asking for help. Every man he talked to agreed to testify, though more than one warned him that fighting a man like Victor Mercer was a good way to end up ruined. Meanwhile, Vivian went into town with June, talking to everyone she'd worked with over the past weeks. Ada promised to close the restaurant if necessary to attend the hearing. Mrs. Chen offered to bring her account books showing how much work Vivian had completed, proof that she was capable and competent. By the time they met back at the ranch that evening, they had a list of 14 people willing to testify on their behalf. It felt like a small army, but Garrett knew Victor would have his own army, lawyers and doctors and expert witnesses who'd say whatever they were paid to say. Christmas Day passed in a blur of preparation. They reviewed Vivian's journal, organized documents, rehearsed testimony. There was no celebration, no gifts, just the grim work of building a defense against a man who'd had 5 years to perfect his lies. That night, exhausted and worried, they sat together at the table long after the fire had burned down to coals. "I'm scared," Vivian admitted. "Not of the hearing itself, but of what happens if we lose. If the judge rules in Victor's favor, he can annul our marriage and take me back to Boston. And this time, he won't be careless. He'll lock me away somewhere I can never escape. We're not going to lose." "You can't promise that." "No. But I can promise that even if things go sideways, even if the judge rules against us, I won't let Victor take you. We'll run if we have to. Head north to Canada or west to California. We'll disappear and start over somewhere he can never find us." Vivian reached across the table and took his hand. It was the first time she'd initiated physical contact, and Garrett felt the weight of that trust settle over him like a blanket. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for all of this. For seeing me when everyone else just saw Victor's version of who I was supposed to be. You're easy to see, Vivian. You just spent 5 years with someone who wanted you invisible." She squeezed his hand once, then let go and stood. "I should get some sleep. Tomorrow we need to find a doctor willing to examine me and testify." "Already got one lined up, Doc Harrison. He's delivered half the babies in the county and doesn't take kindly to bullies. He'll be here first thing in the morning." Vivian nodded and headed to the bedroom. At the door she paused and looked back. "Garrett, if this does go wrong, if Victor wins, I want you to know that these last few weeks have been the freest I've felt in my entire life. Whatever happens, you gave me that. I won't forget it." Then she was gone, the door closing softly behind her. Garrett sat alone in the dark kitchen, listening to the wind howl outside. Somewhere out there, Victor Mercer was planning his next move. Somewhere in Helena, a judge was preparing to decide Vivian's fate based on lies and legal documents and the testimony of men who'd never met her. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. But Garrett had learned a long time ago that life didn't care about fair or right. It only cared about what you were willing to fight for. And he was willing to fight for this. Doc Harrison arrived just after dawn the next morning, his medical bag in one hand and a scowl on his weathered face that suggested he'd already heard enough about Victor Mercer to last a lifetime. He was 70 if he was a day, with hands that shook slightly from age but eyes that missed nothing. "Where's the patient?" he asked, stamping snow off his boots. Vivian emerged from the bedroom, her hair still loose around her shoulders. She'd barely slept. Garrett had heard her moving around most of the night, and it showed in the dark circles under her eyes. "Miss Hale," Doc Harrison said, then corrected himself. "Mrs. Hale, I should say. Congratulations on your marriage." "Thank you, Doctor. Though I understand the circumstances are less than ideal, Sheriff Burke filled me in on some of the details. Your brother's claiming you're not fit to make your own decisions." "That's correct." Doc Harrison set his bag down and pulled out a chair. "Well, let's start with the basics. How old are you?" 25. "And you came to Montana Territory of your own free will?" "Yes. Been holding down employment since you arrived. 2 jobs. I work at Ada Whitmore's restaurant and at Mrs. Chen's dress shop." "Managing your finances?" "What little I have, yes. I've been saving to find my own lodging, though circumstances changed that plan." Doc Harrison nodded, making notes in a small leather book. "Now, I'm going to need to ask some uncomfortable questions, and I'm going to need honest answers. This examination is going to be part of the court record, which means anything you tell me could be read aloud in front of a judge and whoever else is in that courtroom. You understand that?" Vivian's hands tightened in her lap, but her voice stayed steady. "I understand." "Good. Tell me about the injuries." For the next hour, Vivian recounted everything while Doc Harrison examined her. He documented every scar, every poorly healed break, every mark that Victor had left on her body over 5 years of systematic abuse. Garrett sat at the table pretending to review documents, but really just trying not to put his fist through the wall as he listened to the clinical recitation of horrors. When it was done, Doc Harrison closed his book and looked at Vivian with something like respect in his old eyes. Mrs. Hale, I've been practicing medicine for 43 years. I've seen men beat their wives, fathers beat their children, and every other kind of cruelty humans are capable of inflicting on each other. What your brother did to you is among the worst I've documented. And I can say with absolute medical certainty that you are not now, nor have you ever been, mentally incompetent. You're a survivor of prolonged physical and psychological torture, and the fact that you're sitting here answering my questions with this much composure is remarkable. Will you testify to that in court? I'll do better than that. I'll write a report so detailed that any judge who reads it will understand exactly what kind of man Victor Mercer is. And I'll stand up in front of that courtroom and dare anyone to question my findings. After Doc Harrison left, Garrett and Vivian spent the rest of the day preparing. They rode into town to meet with the witnesses who'd agreed to testify, going over what each person would say and how to present it. Ada was fierce and direct, promising to describe Vivian's work ethic and sound judgment. Mrs. Chen spoke quietly, but with conviction about the quality of Vivian's sewing and her reliability. The ranch hands Garrett had worked with over the years vouched for his character and his reputation as a fair man who didn't take advantage of anyone. By evening, they had what felt like a solid case. It wouldn't be easy. Victor had money and lawyers and the weight of establishment respectability on his side. But they had the truth, and Garrett had to believe that still counted for something. They were leaving Ada's restaurant when they ran into Victor again. He was standing outside the hotel with another man, tall, angular, dressed in an expensive suit that screamed East Coast lawyer. Both men watched as Garrett and Vivian walked past, and Victor's smile was the kind that made Garrett's trigger finger itch. "Vivian," Victor called out, "might I have a word with my sister?" "She's not your sister anymore," Garrett said without stopping. "She's my wife. Anything you want to say, you can say it in court." Actually, I think Vivian should hear this from me directly. Victor descended the hotel steps, his lawyer following. "You see, I've been doing some research on you, Mr. Hale. It's fascinating what you can learn about a person when you have resources." Is that supposed to scare me? Not at all, just sharing information. For instance, I learned that your late wife Sarah died 2 years ago under somewhat mysterious circumstances. "Fever," they said, but the doctor's report mentioned that you waited nearly 18 hours before calling for medical help. Some might wonder why a loving husband would delay like that. Garrett felt ice slide down his spine. "Careful, Mercer. I also learned that your ranch is mortgaged to the hilt. You're 3 payments behind, and the bank is getting impatient. Funny how financial desperation can motivate a man to make questionable decisions, like marrying a wealthy woman he barely knows." "I'm not wealthy," Vivian said, her voice tight. "You control everything Father left me. For now. But if this marriage were declared valid, you'd gain access to your inheritance. Quite a windfall for a struggling rancher, wouldn't you say?" "That's not why I married her," Garrett said. "I'm sure you'll have a chance to explain that to the judge. Along with why you rushed into marriage less than 8 weeks after meeting a woman who was clearly in crisis. A woman who'd been traveling for 3 weeks, was alone and frightened, and probably would have agreed to anything if it meant protection from the monster she was running from." Victor's eyes glittered. "Or perhaps you saw an opportunity and took it. Either way, the optics aren't good, Mr. Hale." The lawyer stepped forward, pulling papers from his briefcase. "This is a petition for emergency annulment on the grounds of fraud and coercion. We'll be filing it with the court tomorrow morning. In addition, we're requesting that Vivian be placed under temporary protective custody until her mental state can be properly evaluated by qualified physicians." "Qualified meaning ones you've already paid off," Garrett said. "Qualified meaning doctors with actual credentials from reputable institutions, not some frontier quack with a correspondence degree." "Doc Harrison trained at Harvard Medical School," Vivian said coldly. "He has more credentials than whatever bought and paid for fraud you're bringing in from Boston." Victor's smile widened. My, that's quite the sharp tongue you've developed, sister. Very different from the meek, obedient girl I raised. Perhaps that rancher husband of yours is a bad influence. Or perhaps the strain of maintaining this charade is making you unstable. I wonder what the judge will think." "The judge will think you're a liar and an abuser," Vivian said, and Garrett heard something new in her voice. Not fear, but rage. Because that's what you are, Victor. You've spent 5 years trying to break me, trying to make me believe I was worthless and weak and deserved everything you did to me. But I'm done believing your lies. I'm done being afraid of you. And when that judge reads Doc Harrison's report and sees the scars you left, he's going to know exactly what kind of monster you are. For just a second, Victor's mask slipped. The smooth, charming expression cracked, and something vicious showed through. But he recovered quickly, smoothing his features back into polite concern. We'll see what the judge thinks. I'll see you both in court. He turned and walked back to the hotel, his lawyer trailing behind. Garrett watched them go, his jaw so tight it ached. He's going to twist everything, Vivian said quietly. Make it look like you're the predator and he's the protective brother. Let him try. We've got the truth on our side. The truth didn't protect me for 5 years. Why would it protect me now? Garrett turned to face her. Because this time, you're not alone. This time, you've got people willing to stand up and fight with you. That makes all the difference. But as they rode back to the ranch in the gathering dark, Garrett couldn't shake the cold feeling in his gut. Victor had done his homework, found the weak points, and was preparing to exploit them. The questions about Sarah's death were particularly nasty, implying that Garrett had somehow let his wife die through negligence or worse. It wasn't true, but mud sticks, and in a courtroom full of strangers, perception mattered more than reality. That night, neither of them slept well. Garrett lay in the loft listening to Vivian pace below, and somewhere around midnight, he gave up and climbed down. He found her sitting at the table with her journal open, adding new entries by lamplight. Can't sleep? He asked. Every time I close my eyes, I see that courtroom. I see Victor standing there with his lawyers and his fake concern, and I see the judge believing every word he says. Garrett poured coffee and sat across from her. You want to know what I see? What? I see you standing up in front of everyone and telling your story. Not Victor's version, not some sanitized account that makes it easier to swallow, but the real thing. Every detail, every scar, every moment of fear. I see you looking that judge in the eye and daring him not to believe you. What if I freeze? What if I get up there and the words won't come? Then I'll be right there. Ada will be there. June, Doc Harrison, everyone who knows the truth. You won't be alone in this. Vivian closed the journal, her fingers tracing the worn leather cover. Garrett, there's something I need to tell you about the inheritance Victor mentioned. You don't have to. No, I do, because if this goes to trial, it's going to come out anyway. She took a breath. My father was a wealthy man. When he died, he left everything to me. Property, investments, cash holdings. It's worth about $200,000. Garrett nearly choked on his coffee. That's a fortune. It's a prison. Victor's been controlling it since I was 20, using it to justify his guardianship. He's convinced the courts that I'm too unstable to manage my own affairs, and as my guardian, he has complete authority over the money. He uses it however he wants, traveling, gambling, maintaining his lifestyle. I don't see a penny of it. So when he finds out you married me, he thinks you're after the inheritance. That's what his whole strategy is going to be built on. The desperate rancher who saw a vulnerable woman with money and convinced her to marry him so he could get his hands on her fortune. Except I didn't know about any fortune when I offered you that room. I didn't know when I suggested marriage as a way to escape his guardianship. Hell, I barely knew your last name. I know that, but how do we prove it? How do we convince a judge that this wasn't about money when the timing looks so convenient? Garrett thought about it. We tell the truth, and we show the evidence. Your journal documents years of abuse. Doc Harrison's examination proves you're not unstable. The people who've worked with you can testify to your competence, and I can show bank records proving the ranch was in trouble long before you arrived. If I was looking for an easy way out, I had plenty of time to find it before you showed up. Victor will say you saw an opportunity and took it. Then we point out that if this was really about money, I would have researched your background before proposing, would have known about the inheritance, would have planned this whole thing instead of making a split-second decision on the courthouse steps. Vivian managed a small smile. You're very good at this. The arguing, the logic. You should have been a lawyer. I'm a rancher who's too stubborn to know when to quit. That's different. They sat together in the quiet kitchen, drinking bad coffee and planning their defense until the sky started to lighten. By the time the sun came up, they had a strategy. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and that would have to be enough. The hearing was scheduled for the afternoon of December 28th. They spent the morning getting ready, Vivian putting on her best dress, Garrett wearing the suit he'd married Sarah in and hadn't touched since her funeral. June arrived early to help, bringing a basket of food they were too nervous to eat. "You look terrified," June said, adjusting Garrett's collar. "That obvious? You've got the same expression you had the day Pa made you ride that mean gelding that threw everyone else. Like, you know it's going to hurt, but you're going to do it anyway." "Pretty accurate comparison." June finished with his collar and stepped back. "Garrett, I know you're doing this for the right reasons. But if the judge rules against you, if he annuls the marriage and gives Victor custody of Vivian, what then? Then we run. You'd give up the ranch? Everything you and Sarah built?" Garrett looked toward the bedroom where Vivian was getting ready. "Sarah made me promise I'd keep living after she died. That I wouldn't just survive, but actually live. Helping Vivian, standing up to Victor, this is the first time in 2 years I felt like I'm doing that. So yeah, if it comes down to it, I'd give up the ranch. Some things matter more than property." June's eyes went bright. "She'd be proud of you, you know. Sarah. She always said you had the biggest heart of anyone she'd ever met. She'd want you to do this." Vivian emerged from the bedroom then, and Garrett felt something catch in his chest. She'd pulled her hair back severe and wore a high-necked gray dress that covered every scar, but her shoulders were straight and her chin was up, and she looked like someone ready to walk into battle. "I'm ready," she said. They rode into Black Hollow together, arriving at the courthouse just as the big clock in the square struck noon. A crowd had already gathered. Not a mob exactly, but more people than usually attended civil hearings. Word had spread about the case, and half the town had shown up to watch. Victor was already there, standing on the courthouse steps with his lawyer and 2 men in expensive suits, who had to be the expert witnesses he'd brought from back east. He watched Garrett help Vivian down from the wagon, and his expression was all polite concern with something cruel underneath. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Judge Holloway presided from the bench, a stern man in his 60s with gray hair and a reputation for no-nonsense rulings. He looked over the assembled crowd with clear disapproval. "This is a competency hearing, not a circus," he announced. "Anyone who can't maintain proper decorum will be removed. Is that understood?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The hearing began with Victor's lawyer making his opening statement. His name was Thornton, and he had the smooth, practiced delivery of someone who'd argued cases in front of judges all over the country. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward matter of protecting a vulnerable woman from predation and exploitation." "Miss Vivian Mercer?" "Mrs. Vivian Hale," Garrett interrupted. Judge Holloway's gavel came down. "Mr. Hale, you'll have your chance to speak. Until then, keep quiet." Thornton smiled thinly and continued. "The woman in question has a documented history of mental instability going back 5 years. Her legal guardian, Mr. Victor Mercer, has gone to considerable effort and expense to ensure she receives proper care. When she fled Boston 3 weeks ago, Mr. Mercer immediately began searching for her, fearing for her safety. Imagine his shock upon discovering that she'd been convinced to marry a virtual stranger, a man she'd known less than 2 months, a man with significant financial difficulties who stood to gain considerably from such a union. He went on like that for 20 minutes, painting Garrett as an opportunist and Vivian as a confused, mentally fragile woman who'd been taken advantage of. By the time he finished, half the courtroom was looking at Garrett like he'd done something dirty. Then it was their turn. They didn't have a lawyer, couldn't afford one, so Garrett stood up to speak for them both. His hands were sweating and his heart was hammering, but he kept his voice steady. "Your Honor, everything Mr. Thornton just said is a lie built on top of other lies. Victor Mercer isn't a caring brother trying to protect his sister. He's an abuser who's been torturing her for 5 years. And this hearing is just his latest attempt to maintain control over someone who finally found the courage to escape." Judge Holloway leaned forward. "Those are serious accusations, Mr. Hale. I hope you have evidence to support them." "We do, Your Honor. We have medical documentation, witness testimony, and Vivian's own account, and we're prepared to present all of it." The judge nodded. "Then let's hear it. Mr. Mercer's counsel presented their case. Now you'll present yours. Call your first witness." Garrett called Doc Harrison first. The old doctor took the stand and methodically went through his examination findings, describing each injury in clinical detail. He had photographs, crude but effective, showing the scars on Vivian's wrists, back, and arms. He explained the pattern of healing, the age of each mark, the way they corresponded exactly with entries in Vivian's journal. In my professional opinion, Doc Harrison concluded, these injuries were inflicted deliberately and repeatedly over a period of years. They are consistent with sustained physical abuse. Furthermore, my psychiatric evaluation of Mrs. Hale revealed no signs of mental incompetence, delusion, or instability. She is fully capable of making her own decisions and managing her own affairs. Thornton cross-examined him aggressively, questioning his credentials, his methodology, his judgment. But Doc Harrison had been doing this for 40 years and didn't budge an inch. Next came Ada Whitmore. She described Vivian's work at the restaurant, her reliability, her sound judgment in handling customers, and managing the kitchen during busy periods. That woman has more sense in her little finger than most men have in their whole bodies, Ada declared, and anyone who says different is either blind or lying. Thornton tried to suggest that Ada was biased, that she'd been taken in by Vivian's act. Ada looked at him like he was something she'd scraped off her boot. Young man, I've been running a business in this territory for 30 years. I've employed drunks, thieves, liars, and every other kind of person you can imagine. I know the difference between someone who's genuinely struggling and someone who's playing a part. Vivian Hale is genuine. And if you can't see that, then you're the one who needs your head examined. The courtroom erupted in laughter. Judge Holloway's gavel came down hard, but Garrett saw the hint of a smile at the corner of the judge's mouth. Mrs. Chen testified next, bringing her account books to show the volume and quality of Vivian's work. Then came 3 of Garrett's neighboring ranchers, all vouching for his character and reputation. Then June, who spoke about how she'd watched her brother come back to life after 2 years of barely existing. I know what grief looks like, June said. I watched Garrett after Sarah died, and it was like watching someone drown in slow motion. Then Vivian came, and suddenly he had purpose again. Not because of money or opportunity, but because he saw someone who needed help, and he's the kind of man who can't walk away from that. If that makes him a predator, then every decent person in this territory is guilty of the same crime. By the time they finished, it was late afternoon. Judge Holloway called for a recess, and everyone filed out of the courtroom. Garrett found Vivian standing by the window, her arms wrapped around herself. You're doing great, he said quietly. Am I? Because it feels like we're losing. Did you see how the judge looked at me when Thornton talked about my history of instability? I saw him looking thoughtful. That's different from convinced. Garrett, Victor hasn't even presented his medical witnesses yet. He's going to bring in doctors who will say I'm delusional, that the scars are self-inflicted, that everything in my journal is fantasy, and they're going to sound more credible than Doc Harrison because they have fancy degrees from fancy schools. Then we make sure your testimony outweighs theirs. You get up on that stand tomorrow, and you tell your story. Let the judge see who you really are versus who Victor claims you are. The next morning, they reconvened for the second day of testimony. Victor's side went first, bringing in a psychiatrist from Boston named Dr. Whitmore, who'd apparently examined Vivian several times during her years under Victor's guardianship. Miss Mercer exhibits classic signs of hysteria and delusional thinking, Dr. Whitmore testified. She frequently invented stories about abuse that had no basis in reality. She engaged in self-harm and then blamed her injuries on her brother. Her behavior became so erratic that institutionalization was recommended as the only safe option. It was damning testimony, delivered with absolute certainty. And it was all lies, but lies told by a man with credentials that made them sound like truth. Garrett wanted to stand up and call him a liar right there, but Judge Holloway would have tossed him out of the courtroom. So he sat and listened and waited for their chance to respond. Then Victor himself took the stand. He was good. Garrett had to give him that. Victor played the role of the concerned brother perfectly, worried, exhausted, just trying to do right by his poor, troubled sister. He described coming home to find Vivian hurting herself, finding her hiding in closets, refusing to eat, making wild accusations. He talked about the expensive doctors he'd hired, the treatments he'd paid for, the endless patience he'd shown in the face of her illness. I only want what's best for Vivian, Victor said, his voice breaking just enough to sound genuine. I've dedicated years of my life to caring for her, to trying to help her heal, and then she runs away and marries a man she barely knows, and I'm supposed to believe that's healthy? That's the action of someone in their right mind. He looked directly at the judge. Your Honor, I'm begging you to see reason. My sister needs help, not validation of her delusions. Please don't let this sham marriage stand. Return her to my care so I can get her the treatment she desperately needs." When Victor stepped down, Garrett saw several people in the courtroom wiping their eyes. The performance had been that good. Then it was Vivian's turn. She walked to the stand with her back straight and her hands steady, and when she sat down, she looked directly at Judge Holloway. "Mrs. Hale," Thornton began, "is it true that you have a history of mental illness?" "No. No. But we've just heard testimony from a qualified psychiatrist who examined you multiple times, das Amt. Dr. Whitmore examined me exactly twice, both times at Victor's request, both times with Victor in the room controlling the conversation. He never spoke to me alone. He never asked about the bruises. He wrote exactly what Victor paid him to write." "That's a serious accusation." "It's the truth. Everything Victor and his doctors have said in this courtroom is a lie designed to justify 5 years of systematic abuse." Thornton's expression hardened. "If you were truly being abused, why didn't you report it to the authorities?" "Because Victor convinced me no one would believe me. Because he isolated me from anyone who might have helped. Because the one time I did try to tell someone, a housekeeper, Victor fired her the next day and threatened me with institutionalization if I ever spoke about our private family matters again." "Yet you expect us to believe you now?" Vivian pulled up her sleeves, revealing the scars on her forearms. "These aren't self-inflicted, Mr. Thornton. These are from the time Victor held my wrists over a candle flame because I spoke to a delivery man without permission. This one," she pointed to a faded mark near her elbow, "is from when he threw a crystal decanter at me because I was reading instead of sitting quietly like he'd told me to. This one is from—" "Your Honor," Thornton interrupted. "This is clearly a performance designed to—" "Let her finish," Judge Holloway said quietly. Vivian continued, detailing every scar, every injury, matching them to entries in her journal. She spoke clearly and without embellishment, just facts delivered in a steady voice that grew stronger as she went on. When she was done, she looked at Victor. "You spent 5 years trying to convince me I was worthless, that I was broken and sick and deserved everything you did to me. And for a long time I believed you, but then I ran, and I found people who saw me differently, who treated me like a person instead of property, who gave me choices instead of orders. And I realized that the only sick person in that house was you." She turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, I'm not asking you to take my word over Victor's. I'm asking you to look at the evidence. Read Doc Harrison's report. Talk to the people who've worked with me these past weeks. Ask yourself whether someone who holds down 2 jobs, manages their own affairs, and makes sound decisions every day sounds like someone who needs a guardian. And then ask yourself why a supposedly caring brother would go to such lengths to maintain control over a sister who clearly wants nothing to do with him." The courtroom was dead silent. Judge Holloway sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I'd like to hear from Mr. Hale now." Garrett stood and walked to the stand. His mouth was dry and his hands were shaking, but when he started talking, the words came easier than he expected. "Your Honor, I'm not going to pretend I'm eloquent or educated. I'm a rancher. I work with my hands, I pay my debts when I can, and I try to do right by people. When Vivian showed up in Black Hollow, I saw someone who needed help. That's all it was at first. Then I got to know her, saw how hard she worked, how smart she was, how much strength it took to run from the only life she'd ever known. And I realized I wanted to help her not out of pity, but out of respect. When I suggested marriage, it wasn't about money. I didn't even know she had any. It was about giving her a legal protection Victor couldn't tear down. We can argue all day about whether that was the right decision, but it was an honest one. And if this court decides to annul our marriage and send Vivian back to Boston, then you'll be sending her back to a man who will destroy her. That's not justice. That's just letting a rich man win because he can afford better lawyers." He stepped down, and Judge Holloway rubbed his face with both hands. "I'm going to take a recess to review the evidence. We'll reconvene in 2 hours for my ruling." Those 2 hours were the longest of Garrett's life. He and Vivian sat in Ada's restaurant with their witnesses, drinking coffee and trying not to imagine the worst. June held Vivian's hand. Ada paced like a caged animal. Doc Harrison sat in the corner reading a medical journal like nothing unusual was happening. When they finally filed back into the courtroom, Judge Holloway was already on the bench. His expression gave nothing away. I've reviewed all the evidence and testimony presented in this case, he began, and I've rarely encountered a situation where the truth was more clearly at odds with the official record. Mr. Mercer, you've presented an impressive array of documents and expert witnesses, but documents can be fabricated and experts can be bought. What you couldn't fabricate is the consistent testimony of a dozen people who've interacted with Mrs. Hale in recent weeks and found her to be entirely competent. You also couldn't explain away the physical evidence documented by Dr. Harrison, which corroborates Mrs. Hale's account of sustained abuse. Victor's face went pale. As for the marriage, the judge continued, while the timeline is certainly brief, I find no evidence of fraud or coercion. Mrs. Hale entered into this union willingly and with full understanding of its implications. Mr. Hale's financial difficulties, while unfortunate, do not constitute evidence of predatory intent. If anything, his willingness to stand up for Mrs. Hale, despite the social and legal risks, demonstrates the kind of character that makes for a solid marriage. He looked at Victor. Mr. Mercer, your guardianship is hereby terminated, effective immediately. Mrs. Hale is recognized as a competent adult, fully capable of managing her own affairs. The marriage between Mrs. Hale and Mr. Garrett Hale is ruled valid and will not be annulled. Furthermore, I'm ordering that Mrs. Hale's inheritance be released from your control and transferred to her sole authority within 30 days. If you contest this ruling, I will personally ensure that every piece of evidence presented here is forwarded to the Massachusetts Attorney General for investigation into potential criminal abuse charges. The gavel came down like a gunshot. They'd won. The courtroom erupted in noise the moment Judge Halloway's gavel struck the bench for the final time. Vivian sat frozen in her chair, staring at the judge like she couldn't quite process what had just happened. Garrett reached for her hand and found it ice cold despite the warmth of the packed room. We won, he said quietly. She turned to look at him, and tears were streaming down her face. He can't take me back. No, he can't. Behind them, Ada let out a whoop that made half the courtroom jump. June was crying openly. Doc Harrison nodded once, satisfied, and packed up his medical bag like this had been just another day's work. Victor sat at his table, his face the color of old paper. His lawyer was gathering documents with shaking hands, and the expert witnesses they'd brought from Boston were already heading for the door like the building was on fire. For the first time since Garrett had met him, Victor Mercer looked like exactly what he was, a bully who'd finally been called out in front of everyone. Sheriff Burke appeared at Garrett's elbow. Y'all should leave through the back. There's a crowd forming outside, and while most of them are on your side, emotions are running high. Better to avoid trouble. They took his advice, slipping out through the judge's chambers and into the alley behind the courthouse. The cold air hit Garrett's face like a slap, and he realized he'd been holding his breath for what felt like hours. Vivian stood in the snow, her arms wrapped around herself, and just breathed. In and out, slow and deliberate, like she was learning how to do it all over again. You all right? Garrett asked. I don't know. I feel like I should be happy, but mostly I just feel... She stopped, searching for the word. Empty. Like I've been braced for impact for so long that now that it's over, I don't know what to do with myself. That's normal. Is it? I felt the same way after Sarah's funeral, like I'd been holding my breath through the whole thing, and then suddenly it was done, and I was still here, and I didn't know what came next. June came around the corner then, followed by Ada and half their witnesses. They were laughing and talking over each other, the relief palpable. June hugged Vivian hard enough to lift her off the ground. You did it, June said. You stood up there and told the truth, and you beat him. The judge beat him, Vivian said. I just answered questions. You did a hell of a lot more than that, Ada said. You looked that bastard in the eye and didn't blink. That takes spine. They celebrated at Ada's restaurant that night. She closed early to regular customers and threw together what she called a proper victory dinner. Roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and a pie that was slightly burnt around the edges but tasted like heaven anyway. The dining room filled with everyone who'd testified, plus half the town who'd heard about the verdict and wanted to be part of the celebration. Garrett sat next to Vivian, watching her navigate the crowd with something like wonder on her face. People kept coming up to congratulate her, to shake her hand, to tell her how brave she'd been. Each time, she looked a little more surprised. like she couldn't quite believe these people were talking to her instead of about her. Around 9 o'clock, Mrs. Chen appeared with a package wrapped in brown paper. She set it in front of Vivian without ceremony. "What's this?" Vivian asked. "Open it." Vivian unwrapped the package carefully and found a dress inside. Deep blue wool with pearl buttons and careful stitching along every seam. It was the kind of dress that cost real money, the kind Vivian used to sew for Mrs. Chen's wealthy customers. "I can't accept this," Vivian said. "You can and you will. I had the fabric sitting around and needed to practice a new pattern. Consider it payment for all the extra work you've been doing." "Mrs. Chen, the matter is closed. Wear it in good health." The old seamstress walked away before Vivian could argue further, and Garrett saw his wife. The word still felt strange but good, blinking back tears for what had to be the 100th time that day. They finally left around 11, climbing into the wagon for the long ride back to the ranch. The night was clear and cold. Stars scattered across the sky like someone had thrown diamonds against black velvet. Vivian sat close to Garrett on the bench, and halfway home she leaned her head against his shoulder. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For standing up when you didn't have to. For risking everything on someone you barely knew. For making me believe that maybe I was worth fighting for." Garrett thought about that. "You know what I realized today, listening to you testify?" "What?" "That you never needed saving. You'd already saved yourself the moment you decided to run. All I did was stand next to you while you finished what you started." She was quiet for a while, and when she spoke again, her voice was different, softer. "Garrett, this marriage, I know it started as something practical, a legal protection, but it's real now. The judge said so, the whole town knows it, and I—" She stopped, struggling with the words. "I want it to be real, not just on paper, but actually real, if that's something you'd want too." Garrett's heart kicked hard against his ribs. "Vivian, you don't have to answer now. I know it's complicated. You loved Sarah, and I'm not trying to replace her or rush you into something you're not ready for. I just needed you to know that I'm not running anymore. I'm staying. And if there's ever a time when you think maybe we could be more than just legal partners, I'd like that." He pulled the wagon to a stop right there in the middle of the road. Vivian looked up at him, uncertain, and Garrett did something he'd been thinking about for weeks but hadn't let himself act on. He kissed her. It was brief and careful and completely honest. When he pulled back, Vivian was staring at him with wide eyes. "I'd like that too," Garrett said. "The real thing. Not rushing it, not forcing it, just seeing where it goes. Because somewhere between you stepping off that stagecoach and standing up in that courtroom today, you stopped being someone I was helping and became someone I couldn't imagine my life without." Vivian kissed him back, less careful this time, and Garrett felt something settle into place that he hadn't even realized was broken. They made it back to the ranch a little past midnight. The house was dark and cold, and while Garrett got the fire going, Vivian made coffee. They moved around each other with an easy familiarity that came from weeks of sharing space, but there was something new underneath it now. A charge in the air that hadn't been there before. "I should probably tell you," Vivian said, pouring coffee, "that I have no idea what I'm doing. With this. With us. That makes two of us. Victor controlled everything for so long that I don't even know what a normal marriage looks like. What I'm supposed to want or expect or— How about we don't worry about supposed to," Garrett interrupted. "We just figure out what works for us. No rules except honesty and patience and not letting anyone else tell us how this should go." Vivian smiled. "I can work with that. They stayed up late talking, the conversation wandering from serious to silly and back again. Vivian told him about books she'd loved as a child, about wanting to learn to ride a horse, about ideas she had for expanding the ranch's garden come spring. Garrett told her about Sarah, about the early days of building the ranch, about his sister's terrible cooking and his father's worst jokes. Eventually, they both got tired enough that words started slurring together. Garrett climbed up to the loft while Vivian took the bedroom, but something had shifted. The separation felt temporary now instead of permanent, a step in a process rather than a wall between them. Garrett fell asleep thinking about the future for the first time in 2 years, and it didn't hurt the way it used to. The next few days passed in a strange kind of peace. Word of the court victory had spread through the county, and people kept stopping by the ranch to congratulate them or bring food, or just satisfy their curiosity. Garrett had never been the subject of this much attention, and he found it exhausting. Vivian seemed to take it better, though he noticed she still positioned herself near exits and kept track of who was in the room at all times. On the third day after the hearing, a rider arrived from town with a telegram. It was from Victor's lawyer in Helena, informing them that Victor had departed Montana Territory and returned to Boston. The guardianship papers were being formally dissolved, and the process of transferring Vivian's inheritance would begin immediately. "He's really gone," Vivian said, staring at the telegram. "Looks like it." Just like that. After everything, he just leaves. Garrett heard something in her voice that wasn't quite relief. "You thought there'd be more of a fight." "I thought he'd burn the whole town down before he admitted defeat. That's what he did in Boston anytime he didn't get his way. He destroyed people who crossed him." Maybe the judge scared him. That threat about forwarding evidence to the Attorney General wasn't subtle. Maybe. But Vivian didn't sound convinced. She was right to be suspicious. 3 days later, Garrett rode out to check the north fence line and found it cut in 6 places. Not broken by weather or animals, but deliberately sliced with wire cutters. 20 head of cattle had wandered through the gaps, and it took him half the day to round them up and another few hours to mend the fence. When he got back to the ranch house, he found Vivian white-faced and shaking, holding a piece of paper that had been nailed to the front door. The note was short and written in elegant handwriting Garrett recognized from the legal documents Victor had presented in court. "This isn't over. Enjoy your victory while it lasts." "He's trying to scare us," Garrett said, crumpling the note. "It's working." Vivian's hands were trembling. "The fence wasn't an accident, was it?" "No." "What if he comes back? What if he tries to—" "Then we'll handle it, together, same as we handled everything else." But over the next week, things got worse. More fence got cut. One of the horses turned up lame, like someone had spooked it into running over rough ground. The lock on the barn was broken, and feed was scattered everywhere, wasted. Each incident was small enough that Sheriff Burke said there wasn't much he could do without proof, but together they painted a clear picture. Victor might have left Montana, but he'd left someone behind to make their lives miserable. Garrett started sleeping with his rifle next to the bed. He and Vivian developed a system where she'd ring the dinner bell if anything seemed wrong during the day, and he'd carry a pistol whenever he was working outside. The easy peace they'd found after the court victory evaporated, replaced by constant vigilance and the gnawing fear that something worse was coming. 2 weeks after the fence cutting started, Garrett woke in the middle of the night to the smell of smoke. He was down the loft ladder and grabbing his boots before his brain fully processed what was happening. Vivian appeared from the bedroom at the same time, her eyes wide. "The barn," she said. They ran outside together and saw flames licking up the side of the barn, orange and angry against the black sky. The horses were screaming inside, and Garrett's blood went cold. "Get water," he shouted to Vivian. "I'm getting the horses out." He ran for the barn, yanking the doors open. Smoke poured out in a choking cloud, and inside he could see the fire spreading fast, catching on dry hay and old wood. The horses were in a panic, kicking at their stalls. Garrett grabbed the first horse he could reach, Thunder, his old gelding, and let it out by sheer force of will. The animal was half crazy with fear, but years of trust won out, and it followed him into the cold air. He shoved the reins at Vivian, who'd appeared with a bucket of water that was pathetically inadequate against the growing fire. "Keep them away from the barn," Garrett said, and ran back in. The second horse came easier. The third fought him, rearing and striking out with its front hooves. Garrett took a hoof to the shoulder that sent pain shooting down his arm, but he held on and dragged the horse outside. By the time he got the last horse out, the barn was fully engulfed. Flames roared through the roof, sending sparks into the night sky. Garrett and Vivian stood there with the 4 horses, watching 20 years of work burn to the ground. Vivian was crying, and when Garrett looked at her, he saw his own helpless rage reflected in her face. "This is because of me," she said. "Victor did this because I married you, because I fought back. Victor did this because he's a coward who can't stand losing. Don't you dare take responsibility for his actions. But Garrett, your barn can be rebuilt. The horses are safe. We're safe. That's what matters." Sheriff Burke showed up an hour later with half the town behind him. Someone had seen the fire from the road and raised the alarm. Men formed a bucket brigade to keep the flames from spreading to the house, but the barn was a loss. By dawn, all that remained was a smoking skeleton of charred timbers. Burke walked through the debris with Garrett, pointing out the evidence of arson. Fire started in 3 places at once. Someone used kerosene, looks like. Set it up to burn fast and hot. Victor Mercer did this. Maybe. Or someone he hired. Either way, proving it's going to be near impossible. Mercer's in Boston, got himself an alibi tight as a drum, and unless we catch whoever he paid to do this, there's nothing I can charge him with. So he just gets away with it. For now. But Garrett, this kind of escalation, it usually means whoever's doing it is getting desperate. They're running out of options, so they're going for something dramatic. If we can catch them in the act, if. That's a big if when my barn's already ash and my wife's terrified to sleep at night. Burke didn't have an answer for that. The town rallied again, same as they had for the court case. By noon, people started arriving with tools and lumber and offers to help rebuild. June showed up with food. Ada brought blankets for the horses. Mrs. Chen appeared with a donation of $50, a fortune for her, and refused to take no for an answer. Use it for lumber, she said firmly, or for whatever else you need. This community takes care of its own, and you're one of us now. By the end of the day, they had the foundation laid for a new barn and enough pledged labor to have it framed within the week. Garrett was overwhelmed by the support, but he also knew it didn't solve the real problem. Victor was out there somewhere, pulling strings, and he wasn't going to stop until he'd destroyed everything Garrett and Vivian had built. That night, with the horses temporarily housed in a makeshift corral, and the smell of smoke still heavy in the air, Garrett and Vivian sat at the kitchen table planning their next move. "We can't keep living like this," Vivian said, "waiting for the next attack, looking over our shoulders every minute. Victor's going to keep escalating until someone gets hurt. So what do you want to do? Run? No, I'm done running, but we need to find whoever he hired. We need proof that connects the sabotage back to Victor, and then we need to make sure he can't hurt us anymore." Easier said than done. I know. But Garrett, I've been thinking about something. Victor's arrogant. He always has been. He thinks he's smarter than everyone else, and that makes him careless sometimes. He'll have communicated with whoever he hired, letters, telegrams, something. And if we can find those communications, we'd have evidence. Exactly. Garrett thought about it. The hotel. If Victor was sending telegrams from Black Hollow, the telegraph office would have records. And if he was receiving correspondence, the hotel might have held mail for him. It's worth checking. They went into town the next morning and talked to the telegraph operator, a nervous man named Willis who looked like he wished he was anywhere else. "I can't just hand over private correspondence," he said. "That's against regulations." "Even if it's evidence of a crime?" Garrett asked. "Even then, you'd need a court order. How long does that take?" "Weeks, maybe months." They tried the hotel next, but Mrs. McCreary was equally unhelpful. "Mr. Mercer was a guest in good standing. I can't violate his privacy." "He burned down my barn," Garrett said flatly. "You got proof of that?" They didn't, of course. That was the whole problem. Frustrated and running out of options, they were walking back to the wagon when they ran into an unlikely ally. Patterson, the nervous courthouse clerk who'd processed their marriage license, was coming out of the general store with a bag of supplies. "Mr. and Mrs. Hale," he said, tipping his hat. "I heard about the fire. Terrible business." "Yeah," Garrett said. Patterson glanced around, then stepped closer and lowered his voice. "I shouldn't be telling you this, but I saw Mr. Mercer at the telegraph office 3 days before the fire. He was sending a message to someone in Helena. I happened to see part of it while I was waiting to send my own telegram." "What did it say?" "Something about making the rancher regret his interference and use whatever means necessary. The operator is old Willis's nephew, and he owes me a favor. If you wanted to see the full message, I might be able to arrange it. Unofficially." Garrett and Vivian exchanged a look. "We'd appreciate that," Garrett said. 2 days later, Patterson showed up at the ranch with a piece of paper. It was a copy of Victor's telegram, and it was damning. "To Samuel Cross, Helena. Execute the plan discussed. Make the rancher regret his interference. Use whatever means necessary. Ensure no direct connection to me. Payment on completion as agreed. VM." "Samuel Cross," Sheriff Burke said when they showed him the telegram that afternoon. "I know that name. Small-time criminal does dirty work for rich folks who want to keep their hands clean. If Victor hired him, Cross is probably the one cutting your fences and burning your barn. Can you arrest him? If I can find him, and if this telegram is admissible as evidence, Patterson shouldn't have given it to you, and a lawyer could argue it was obtained illegally. But it proves Victor's behind everything. Proves he sent a suspicious telegram. Not quite the same thing, but it's a start. Let me do some digging, see if I can track down Cross and tie him to the sabotage directly. It took 3 more days, but Burke finally got the break they needed. One of the deputies spotted Cross in a saloon in Helena, drinking away money he'd suddenly come into. They arrested him on suspicion of arson, and when they searched his room, they found kerosene cans that matched the residue from Garrett's barn fire, along with wire cutters and a letter from Victor outlining the exact payment structure for various acts of sabotage. Cross tried to claim he was innocent, but the evidence was overwhelming. Faced with a choice between taking the fall alone or implicating his employer, he chose self-preservation. He gave a full confession, detailing every job Victor had hired him for and providing copies of their correspondence. Sheriff Burke sent all of it to the Massachusetts Attorney General, along with Doc Harrison's medical report and the court transcripts from the competency hearing. Within 2 weeks, warrants were issued for Victor Mercer's arrest on charges of conspiracy, criminal harassment, and abuse. The news reached Black Hollow via telegram on a cold February morning. Garrett read it aloud to Vivian while they sat at breakfast, and when he finished, she just sat there staring at her coffee. "He's going to be arrested," she said slowly, like she was testing the words. "Actually, arrested. Charged with crimes. Held accountable. Looks like it." "I never thought," her voice broke. "For 5 years I believed he was untouchable, that nothing I did would ever be enough to stop him, and now he's going to face a judge and answer for what he did. Justice doesn't always come easy, but it comes." Vivian stood up abruptly and walked to the window, looking out at the partially rebuilt barn and the mountains beyond. "I spent so long being afraid of him, afraid of what he'd do, who he'd hurt, how far he'd go to maintain control. And now it's over. Actually over. I don't have to be afraid anymore." Garrett joined her at the window, putting his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, and they stood there together watching the sun climb higher over the valley. "What do you want to do now?" Garrett asked. "Live, just live. Build the life I want instead of the one Victor tried to force on me. Work in the garden, help with the ranch, maybe open that dress shop I've been thinking about. Normal things, boring things, things that are mine." "Sounds like a good plan." She turned to face him, and there were tears on her face, but she was smiling. "Garrett Hale, somewhere between being terrified and furious and fighting for my life, I fell in love with you. I don't know when it happened exactly, and I know it's probably too soon to say it, but I'm done hiding how I feel. I love you, and I want to build a real life with you. Not because I need protection or because marriage was the only legal option, but because you're the best man I've ever known, and I can't imagine being anywhere else." Garrett felt his throat tighten. "I love you too, and I know Sarah would be happy about that, because she always said I needed someone who could match my stubborn streak. You definitely qualify." Vivian laughed, and it was the freest sound Garrett had ever heard her make. They kissed there in the kitchen with morning light streaming through the windows, and for the first time since Victor had shown up in Black Hollow, the future felt like something to look forward to instead of something to survive. The barn got finished 2 weeks later, bigger and better than the old one. The whole town showed up for the raising, and Ada brought enough food to feed an army. By sunset, they had a structure that would last another 20 years, and Garrett stood looking at it with Vivian beside him, thinking about how communities could build something stronger than any one person could tear down. That night, Vivian moved her things from the bedroom to the loft, and Garrett understood what she was saying without words. They were building something real now, not hiding behind separate rooms or legal arrangements, but actually building a marriage that was theirs and no one else's. They took it slow, learning each other with patience and care, and Garrett realized that love the second time around was different than the first. It wasn't less, it was just different. Where he and Sarah had been young and passionate and certain, he and Vivian were careful and intentional and aware of how fragile good things could be. But it worked. It was real. And when spring finally came to Montana territory, melting the snow and bringing new life to the valley, Garrett Hale looked at his wife working in the garden and thought that maybe surviving hell was worth it if this was what waited on the other side. Spring came to Montana territory the way it always did, reluctant and messy. The snow melting into mud that turned the roads into rivers and made every trip to town an adventure in staying upright. But to Vivian, standing in the garden plot she'd cleared and replanted, it felt like the first spring she'd ever experienced, the first one that belonged entirely to her. She was on her knees pulling weeds when the letter arrived. Garrett rode up from town mid-morning with the mail, and she knew from his expression that something significant had come. "It's from Boston," he said, handing her the envelope. Vivian wiped dirt from her hands and opened it carefully. Inside was an official letter from the Massachusetts Attorney General's office, along with several other documents. She read through them twice, her heart hammering, then looked up at Garrett. Victor's been arrested. They charged him with 15 counts, including fraud, assault, conspiracy, and unlawful imprisonment. The trial's set for June. How do you feel about that? It was a good question. Vivian sat back on her heels, trying to sort through the tangle of emotions. Relieved, angry that it took this long, scared that somehow he'll talk his way out of it, and she stopped, surprised by what she was about to say. Sad, is that wrong? To feel sad for someone who hurt you that badly? I don't think feelings are wrong or right, they just are. He's still my brother, my only family besides you now. And I remember when we were children, before Father's death changed everything, Victor used to protect me. He taught me to read, helped me with mathematics, told me stories when I couldn't sleep. That person's gone. Maybe he was never really there, but some part of me mourns him anyway. Garrett sat down beside her in the dirt, not caring that it would ruin his work pants. You can mourn the brother you should have had while still holding the one you got accountable for what he did. Those things don't cancel each other out. I don't think I want to go back for the trial. Does that make me a coward? Makes you someone who's finally putting herself first. They've got all the evidence they need from the Montana case. You don't owe anyone your presence in that courtroom. Vivian nodded, folding the letter carefully. There's something else. The inheritance. The paperwork's complete. The money's been transferred to my name. All of it. That's good news. It's $240,000, Garrett. That's more money than most people see in 10 lifetimes. And I don't know what to do with it. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the mountains. What do you want to do with it? I want to make something good out of something that caused so much pain. Victor used that money to control people, to buy silence, to hurt anyone who got in his way. I want to use it differently. Like how? Vivian had been thinking about this for weeks, ever since Doc Harrison had mentioned during one of his visits that he'd seen 3 women in the past month with injuries that looked like domestic violence, but who refused to press charges because they had nowhere else to go. I want to open a house, she said, a safe place for women who need to escape, somewhere they can stay while they figure out their next step, where they can learn skills and save money and not have to choose between abuse and starvation. Garrett smiled. That sounds exactly right. You don't think it's crazy? I barely escaped myself. What makes me qualified to help others? You escaped because you were brave and smart and refused to accept that Victor's version of your life was the only option. That makes you exactly qualified. Those women need someone who understands what they're going through, not someone who's going to judge them for not leaving sooner or staying too long. They talked about it through lunch and into the afternoon, sketching out ideas on paper. Vivian wanted to buy a house in Black Hollow, big enough for multiple women and their children. She wanted to hire teachers who could provide education and job training. She wanted to work with Ada and Mrs. Chen to create employment opportunities that would allow women to become financially independent. It's going to be expensive, Garrett warned. Not just buying the house, but maintaining it, paying staff, covering costs for women who can't pay anything. I have the money. For now. But if you want this to last, you'll need to think about sustainability. Maybe invest some of it, create an endowment that generates income to cover operating costs. Vivian looked at him with surprise. When did you become a financial expert? I'm not, but I've been running a ranch on tight margins for 20 years. You learn to think long-term, or you don't survive. Over the next month, they put the plan into action. Vivian found a house on the edge of town, a large, somewhat run-down place that had belonged to a mining family who'd moved to California. It needed work, but the bones were solid and it had enough bedrooms to house 8 women comfortably. She bought it outright, then hired a contractor to make repairs and add safety features, locks on every bedroom door, reinforced windows, a back exit that couldn't be easily blocked. Ada signed on immediately to help with food and kitchen management. Mrs. Chen agreed to provide sewing instruction and employment at her shop for any women who wanted to learn the trade. June volunteered to teach basic reading and mathematics. Even Doc Harrison offered to provide free medical care to any residents who needed it. The town council meeting where Vivian presented her plans was tense. Several of the older men objected to the idea of bringing that kind of woman into Black Hollow. They worried about reputation, about attracting unsavory characters, about undermining family values. Vivian stood in front of them all and spoke without notes or preparation, just raw honesty. "I was that kind of woman 6 months ago," she said, "running from an abusive situation with nothing but a carpet bag and hope. If this town hadn't welcomed me, if people like Ada and Mrs. Chen and Sheriff Burke hadn't given me a chance, I'd probably be locked in an asylum right now or dead. So when you talk about that kind of woman, remember you're talking about someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's mother. You're talking about human beings who deserve safety and dignity and a chance to build better lives. And if Black Hollow isn't the kind of town that provides that, then maybe we need to reconsider what our values actually are." The vote passed 7-3. By mid-May, Mercy House opened its doors. Vivian had named it after an idea rather than a person, mercy being something she'd received and now wanted to give. The first resident arrived the same day, a woman named Catherine with 2 small children and a black eye that was still healing. She'd walked 15 miles from a neighboring county after her husband had beaten her badly enough that she feared for her life. Vivian showed her to a small bedroom on the 2nd floor, gave her the key, and said the same words Garrett had said to her that first night. "The door locks from the inside. You won't see me unless you want to, and you're safe here." Catherine had started crying and couldn't stop for an hour. Within 2 weeks, Mercy House was full. Women arrived by stage, by wagon, on foot. They came from ranches and mining camps and small towns all over the territory. Each one carried her own story of violence and fear, and each one left something heavy behind when she walked through those doors. Vivian worked herself to exhaustion those first months. She cooked, cleaned, mediated disputes, held crying women, played with traumatized children, and fell into bed each night so tired she couldn't remember her own name. But she'd never felt more purposeful in her life. Garrett worried about her. He could see the toll it was taking, the weight she was losing, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she sometimes woke in the middle of the night from dreams about Victor or the women she was trying to help. "You can't save everyone," he told her one night after she'd come home particularly defeated. A woman had arrived that afternoon only to leave that same evening, returning to her husband despite everyone's attempts to convince her to stay. "I know that," Vivian said, "but I have to try. Even if it destroys you in the process?" "I'm not being destroyed, I'm being useful. There's a difference." "Is there? Because from where I'm sitting, you're running yourself into the ground trying to fix problems that took years to create. You can't carry all of this alone." "I'm not alone. I have you and Ada and June, and you're still taking on too much. Vivian, you need to hire more staff. You need to set boundaries. You need to remember that you're a person too, not just a resource for everyone else to drain." She knew he was right, but knowing and doing were different things. Every time she thought about pulling back, another woman would arrive with nowhere else to go. And Vivian would remember standing in that courtroom feeling utterly alone, except for the few people who'd chosen to stand beside her. The breaking point came in July. A woman named Sarah, the shared name with Garrett's late wife felt like fate's cruel joke, arrived with 3 children and injuries so severe Doc Harrison insisted on immediate hospitalization. Her husband had tracked her to a friend's house and beaten her so badly she'd lost hearing in one ear and had fractures in both hands. Vivian sat with Sarah at the hospital, holding her bandaged hand and promising her that she was safe now. But that night, Sarah's husband showed up at Mercy House drunk and armed, demanding to know where his wife was. Sheriff Burke arrested him before anyone got hurt, but the incident shook everyone. 2 of the residents left the next day, too frightened to stay. The town council called an emergency meeting to discuss whether Mercy House posed a danger to the community. Vivian stood in front of them again, but this time she was tired down to her bones and the words came harder. "You're right that there's risk," she said. Men who abuse their wives don't like losing control, and some of them will come looking. We can improve security, work more closely with the sheriff's office, put protocols in place. But shutting down Mercy House isn't the answer. That just sends women back to situations that will kill them. Is that really what this town wants? To be the place that looked the other way while women died because helping them was inconvenient? The council voted to keep Mercy House open, but with conditions. Increased security measures, mandatory reporting to the sheriff's office when residents arrived, and regular inspections to ensure everything was being run properly. It felt like a victory and a defeat at the same time. That night, Garrett found Vivian sitting on the porch of their ranch house, staring at nothing. He sat beside her and waited. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," she said finally. "Then don't. I can't just abandon them." "I'm not saying abandon anyone. I'm saying you need to restructure how this works. Hire a manager to handle the day-to-day operations. Build a board of directors who can share the decision-making. Turn Mercy House into something that can function without you having to sacrifice yourself to keep it running." That feels like failing. It's not failing to acknowledge your limits. It's wisdom. You've built something important, Vivian, something that's going to help people for years to come. But it won't help anyone if you collapse from exhaustion or burn out completely. You need to build it in a way that's sustainable, and that means not carrying the whole weight yourself. She leaned against him, and Garrett wrapped his arm around her shoulders. They sat there in the summer darkness, listening to crickets and the distant sound of cattle, and Vivian let herself cry for the first time in months. Over the next few weeks, she took Garrett's advice. She hired a woman named Margaret, a former school teacher who'd left an abusive marriage and had been staying at Mercy House, to serve as house manager. She formed a board of directors that included Ada, Mrs. Chen, Doc Harrison, and 3 other community members who believed in the mission. She created written policies and procedures, established a budget, and learned to delegate instead of trying to do everything herself. It was harder than she'd expected, letting go of control. But gradually, she began to see that Mercy House could function without her constant presence. The women still came, still found safety and support, still left to build better lives. And Vivian found she could help them more effectively when she wasn't exhausted and overwhelmed. She also found time to focus on her marriage. She and Garrett had been living as husband and wife for months now, but the constant demands of Mercy House had created distance between them. They'd fallen into a pattern where Vivian was always rushing off to handle some crisis, and Garrett was left managing the ranch alone. One evening in late August, Garrett suggested they take a day off. Just the 2 of them. No work, no obligations, just time together. Vivian almost said no automatically, already thinking about everything that needed to be done. But she caught herself and realized she couldn't remember the last time they'd had a full day together without interruptions. "All right," she said. Where do you want to go?" They rode up into the mountains, following a trail Garrett knew from years of exploring the territory. The higher they climbed, the cooler the air became, the scent of pine replacing the dry heat of the valley. Eventually, they reached a meadow that overlooked the entire county. Black Hollow, a tiny collection of buildings in the distance. The ranch an even smaller dot against the vast landscape. They stopped to eat lunch, sitting on a flat rock with the whole world spread out below them. "Sarah and I used to come up here," Garrett said quietly, "when the ranch got to be too much, when we needed to remember why we were doing it. She'd sit right where you're sitting and tell me her plans for the future. Crops she wanted to try, improvements to the house, someday having children who'd run wild in these mountains." Vivian wasn't sure what to say to that. She knew Garrett still missed Sarah, would probably always miss her, but he rarely talked about her directly. "Does it bother you that I brought you here?" he asked. "No, it feels right, actually, like she's part of this too in a way." Garrett nodded. "I used to think loving someone new would feel like betraying her memory, like I was supposed to stay frozen in that grief forever. But that's not what she would have wanted. Sarah believed in living fully, in taking chances, in not letting fear make your decisions. She would have liked you, I think, would have respected what you're doing with Mercy House. I wish I could have known her. In some ways you do. The ranch, the garden, the way certain things are arranged in the house, all of that came from her. And now it's yours to change or keep as you want. That's how it should be." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching clouds move across the sky. Then Vivian said something she'd been thinking about for weeks but hadn't known how to voice. "I want a family, children. I know we haven't talked about it, and maybe it's too soon, but I've been working with all these mothers at Mercy House and watching them with their kids, and I realize I want that. Not to replace what you had with Sarah, but to build something that's ours." Garrett took her hand. "I want that too. I'm not getting any younger, and the ranch could use some life beyond 2 stubborn adults and a collection of livestock." "You're sure? Because raising children is terrifying, exhausting, and completely worth it. Or so I've been told by everyone who has them. We'll figure it out together, same as we figured out everything else." That night, under the stars in that mountain meadow, they made love with the kind of intention that comes from choosing each other fully. Not out of desperation or legal necessity or fear, but out of genuine love and hope for the future. 2 months later, Vivian realized she was pregnant. The news hit her like a freight train, joy and terror in equal measure. She told Garrett over breakfast, stammering through the words, and watched his face transform from surprise to something that looked like wonder. "A baby," he said, like he was testing the words. "Are you happy?" Happy doesn't begin to cover it. Terrified might be more accurate, but yes, happy underneath the terror. "I'm scared too. What if I'm terrible at this? What if I repeat all the mistakes my father made? Or worse, what if I turn into someone like Victor?" Garrett came around the table and knelt beside her chair, taking both her hands. "Vivian, you spent 5 years surviving abuse and came out the other side more compassionate, not more cruel. You've built a whole house dedicated to helping people who are suffering. You're nothing like Victor, and you never will be. Our child is going to be loved and safe and taught that their worth isn't dependent on being perfect." The pregnancy was difficult. Vivian was sick for the first 4 months, exhausted all the time, and terrified something would go wrong. Doc Harrison checked on her weekly, reassuring her that everything was progressing normally, but fear didn't listen to medical facts. The women at Mercy House rallied around her. The ones who'd had children before shared advice, helped her prepare, and promised they'd be there when the baby came. Ada knitted tiny blankets. Mrs. Chen sewed impossibly small clothes. June started planning a nursery that would probably be more elaborate than the rest of the house combined. And through it all, Garrett was steady. He picked up extra work around the ranch so Vivian could rest. He held her hair when she was sick. He talked to her belly at night, telling their unborn child about the mountains and the ranch, and all the things they'd do together. In March, on a night when the wind was howling and snow was falling sideways, Vivian went into labor. It was long and brutal, and nothing like the calm birth she'd witnessed at Mercy House. Doc Harrison stayed the whole time. June held her hand, and Garrett paced the hallway, looking like he was going to wear a groove in the floorboards. 14 hours after it started, Vivian gave birth to a daughter who came out screaming her fury at the world. "She's got your lungs," Doc Harrison said, laughing as he cleaned the baby and wrapped her in blankets. They named her Clara, after a woman from Boston who'd testified against Victor at his trial, someone Vivian had never met, but whose courage had helped put her brother in prison for 15 years. Clara Elizabeth Hale, 7 pounds of pure stubborn determination if her first few hours were any indication. Garrett held his daughter with the careful reverence of someone who'd been given something precious beyond measure. He looked at Vivian with tears streaming down his face and whispered, "Thank you." The first months of parenthood were chaos. Clara was colicky and didn't sleep more than 2 hours at a stretch. Vivian was exhausted, overwhelmed, and convinced she was doing everything wrong. But gradually, they found their rhythm. Garrett learned to swaddle Clara so she'd settle. Vivian learned to trust her instincts. They took turns with night feedings, supported each other through the hard moments, and celebrated every small milestone like it was a miracle. Because, in a way, it was. This tiny person who'd come from so much pain and struggle was proof that new beginnings were possible, that the future didn't have to be defined by the past. When Clara was 3 months old, Vivian brought her to Mercy House for the first time. The women there surrounded them immediately, cooing over the baby and asking if they could hold her. Vivian watched them, some of whom were pregnant themselves, some who'd left children behind when they fled, all of whom carried their own complicated relationships with motherhood, and saw the hope in their faces. "She's beautiful," Margaret said, gently rocking Clara, "and living proof that you can come through hell and still build something good on the other side." That became the unofficial motto of Mercy House, written above the front door in June's careful script, "Through hell to home." Over the next year, Mercy House helped 43 women and 67 children. Some stayed a few weeks, some stayed months. A few moved on to other states, building new lives far from the men who'd hurt them. Others settled in Black Hollow and surrounding areas, becoming part of the community. The success rate wasn't perfect. Some women returned to their abusers despite everyone's efforts to convince them otherwise. A few struggled with addiction or mental illness beyond what the house could handle. But for every failure, there were 3 or 4 women who left Mercy House with jobs, savings, and genuine hope for the future. Vivian learned to accept that she couldn't save everyone. She learned that sometimes the best you could do was offer a safe place and let people make their own choices. She learned that healing wasn't linear, that setbacks didn't mean failure, and that the work of helping others required accepting your own limitations. She also learned that happiness didn't mean the absence of struggle. Life was still hard sometimes. The ranch still barely broke even most years. Mercy House still faced funding challenges and community resistance. Clara was a difficult baby who grew into a toddler with opinions about everything. Vivian still had nightmares about Victor occasionally, still flinched at sudden movements, still carried scars that would never fully fade. But alongside the struggle was joy. Watching Garrett teach Clara to feed the chickens, seeing women graduate from Mercy House and start their own businesses, Sunday dinners with June and Ada and everyone who'd become family, quiet mornings in the garden, her hands in the soil, the Montana sun on her face. 2 years after Clara's birth, official word came from Boston. Victor had served a year of his sentence before dying in prison. Tuberculosis, according to the medical report, though the details were sparse. No family had claimed his body. No one had attended his burial. Vivian received the notification via telegram and sat with it for a long time, trying to understand what she felt. It wasn't grief exactly, though there was sadness mixed in. It wasn't relief, though that was there too. Mostly, it was a kind of quiet closure. The man who'd defined her life for so long was gone, and his absence didn't change anything about who she'd become. "Do you want to talk about it?" Garrett asked that evening after Clara was asleep. "I don't think so. Is that wrong?" "No. You don't owe him your grief any more than you owed him your obedience. I keep thinking about what you said once, about mourning the brother I should have had while holding the one I got accountable. Victor's dead now, so there's no more accountability to enforce. But the brother I should have had, the one who taught me to read and protected me when I was small, he died years ago. Maybe when our father died, maybe even before that. This is just making it official." She folded the telegram carefully and put it in the box where she kept important documents. Then she went outside and stood on the porch, looking at the mountains and the vast sky and the life she'd built from the ashes of the one that had tried to destroy her. Garrett joined her, putting his arm around her waist. They stood there together in the gathering dark, and Vivian realized something important. She was happy. Actually, genuinely happy. Not despite everything that had happened, but in some strange way because of it. The pain had taught her resilience. The fear had taught her courage. The loneliness had taught her to value connection. She'd been broken and had put herself back together differently, and the new version was stronger than the original ever could have been. "You know what I've learned?" she said quietly. "What's that?" "That survival isn't enough. For years I thought if I could just make it through each day, if I could just endure whatever Victor did to me and stay alive, that would be achievement enough. But surviving isn't the same as living. Living means taking risks, building things, loving people, making choices that might fail but trying anyway. You taught me that. I think you taught yourself. I just happened to be there when you figured it out. We taught each other then, because you were surviving too before I came. Just going through the motions, keeping the ranch running but not really living. We gave each other a reason to try again." Garrett kissed the top of her head. "Best decision I ever made, catching you when you fell off that stagecoach. You didn't catch me. I collapsed into you. There's a difference. Either way, I'm glad it happened." They went back inside, where Clara was starting to fuss in her cradle. Vivian picked her up, settling into the rocking chair Garrett had made during her pregnancy. She fed their daughter while Garrett banked the fire and tidied the kitchen, and the simple domestic normalcy of it all felt like the greatest victory she could have imagined. This was what freedom looked like. Not a dramatic escape or a legal triumph, though those had been necessary steps. Real freedom was the quiet moments, the choices that were entirely hers, the ability to build a life that reflected her values instead of someone else's control. As Clara drifted back to sleep, Vivian thought about all the women who'd passed through Mercy House over the past 2 years. Each one had arrived carrying trauma and fear, and each one had left carrying something else: hope, skills, determination, the knowledge that they deserved better. Some of them would make it, building new lives far from the pain that had defined them. Some would struggle, falling back into old patterns because change was hard and fear was powerful. But all of them would know that someone had believed they were worth fighting for. That mattered. Maybe it didn't change the world, but it changed individual worlds, and that was enough. By the time Clara turned 3, Mercy House had expanded twice. They'd bought the neighboring property and converted it into transitional housing for women who were ready to live independently but needed temporary support. They'd started a scholarship program to help residents get job training. They'd partnered with other organizations across the territory to create a network of safe houses. And Vivian had learned to step back. She was still on the board, still involved in major decisions, still passionate about the mission. But Margaret ran the day-to-day operations, and a whole team of staff and volunteers kept things running smoothly. Vivian could focus on being a wife and mother and rancher without guilt, knowing the work would continue with or without her constant presence. She'd also started writing. Nothing fancy, just her experiences, lessons learned, advice for other women trying to escape abuse. She didn't know if anyone would ever read it, but putting the words on paper felt important, like documenting the journey from victim to survivor to something more. Person who'd been hurt but refused to let that hurt define her entire existence. One evening in late summer, when Clara was playing in the dirt and Garrett was mending fence, Vivian sat on the porch with her journal and wrote something that felt like truth. I spent 5 years learning to be small, to take up less space, make less noise, want less from life. My brother taught me that my existence was a burden, that my needs were inconvenient, that my very presence required apology. And I believed him because when you're told something often enough by someone with power over you, it becomes the truth you live by. But here's what I know now. Taking up space is not a crime. Having needs is not weakness. Wanting more from life than mere survival is not selfishness. I deserve to be here. I deserve to be happy. I deserve to build a life that's mine and no one else's. And so does every woman who walks through the doors of Mercy House. So does every person who's been told they're less than, broken, unworthy of care. We all deserve the chance to rebuild ourselves into something we choose rather than something that was chosen for us. That's what freedom really means. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of choice. The ability to decide who you want to be and then do the hard work of becoming that person. It's not easy. It's not smooth or linear or guaranteed, but it's possible. And possibility is everything. She closed the journal and looked out at the mountains, at the ranch, at her husband and daughter, and the life they'd built together. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. But it was theirs, and it was real, and it was enough. That night, after Clara was asleep and the house was quiet, Vivian and Garrett sat together at the kitchen table drinking coffee and making plans for the coming year. The ranch needed a new roof. Mercy House was considering opening a second location. Clara would start school soon. Life kept moving forward, bringing new challenges and new joys in equal measure. "You ever think about where we'd be if things had gone differently?" Garrett asked. "Sometimes. If that stagecoach hadn't been late, if you hadn't been standing there when I collapsed, if we'd lost the court case. And I'm grateful things went the way they did. Not grateful for the pain I could have done without 5 years of abuse and a brother who tried to destroy me, but grateful for what came after. For you, for Clara, for Mercy House, for all of it. Even the barn burning down?" Vivian laughed. "Even that. Because it taught us that people will show up when you need them. That community means something, that we're stronger together than we ever could be apart." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Garrett said something that surprised her. "I'm proud of you, you know. Of everything you've built, everything you've become. Sarah would be proud too." "You think so?" "I know so. She always said the measure of a person wasn't what happened to them, but what they did with it. You took the worst thing that ever happened to you and used it to help other people. That's the definition of strength." Vivian felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm proud of you too. Of the man who saw someone in trouble and helped without expecting anything in return. Of the father who talks to his daughter like she's a person worth listening to. Of the husband who's patient with all my broken pieces." "You're not broken. You're healing. There's a difference." Maybe we're both healing, together. I can live with that. They went to bed that night wrapped in each other, and Vivian fell asleep thinking about beginnings instead of endings, about all the women who would walk through Mercy House's doors tomorrow and next week and next year, about the daughter sleeping down the hall who would grow up knowing she was valued and loved and capable of anything, about the husband beside her who'd chosen to stand with her when he could have walked away. The future wasn't certain. It never was. But it was hers to shape, and that made all the difference. Years later, when Clara was grown and Mercy House had helped hundreds of women build new lives, Vivian would look back on those early days in Montana Territory and understand something she couldn't have known at the time. The moment she stepped off that stagecoach and collapsed into Garrett Hale's arms wasn't the end of her story. It was barely even the beginning. The real story was everything that came after. The slow, painful work of rebuilding a self that had been systematically destroyed. The courage it took to trust again after trust had been weaponized against her. The choice to use her pain as a bridge to help others instead of letting it turn her bitter and afraid. That was the story worth telling. Not the abuse itself, that was just background noise, context for understanding the journey. The real story was about resilience, about ordinary people doing extraordinary things because someone needed help and they decided to care. About communities that chose to protect the vulnerable instead of looking the away. About love that grew slowly and honestly, built on mutual respect rather than desperation or dependency. It was a story about second chances and new beginnings. About the difference between surviving and living, about the fact that your past doesn't have to define your future unless you let it. And it was a story that continued long after Vivian stopped being the center of it. Because Mercy House outlived its founder, helping generation after generation of women escape violence and build better lives. Because the children who grew up there, Clara among them, learned that safety was a right, not a privilege, and carried that knowledge into their own relationships. Because the ripple effects of kindness spread wider than any single person could track. On a spring morning that felt like every spring morning, and no spring morning all at once, Vivian stood in the garden with dirt under her fingernails and the Montana sun on her face. Clara was 20 now, studying law in Helena with plans to fight for women's rights. Garrett was gray-haired and moving slower but still strong, still steady, still the man who'd caught her when she'd fallen and refused to let go. Mercy House stood on the edge of town, a permanent fixture now, accepted and supported by a community that had learned to value protection over propriety. The current residents were working in the garden, their laughter carrying on the wind, and Vivian watched them with satisfaction. This was legacy. Not money or property or even the house itself, though all of that mattered. The real legacy was the knowledge she'd passed on, that you could be hurt without being destroyed, that you could escape and build something new, that asking for help was strength, not weakness. She'd learned it the hard way. But because she'd learned it, others didn't have to. And that, more than any legal victory or personal triumph, was what mattered most. Garrett came up behind her, putting his arms around her waist the way he'd done 1,000 times before. She leaned back against him, and they stood there together watching the life they'd built continue without their constant supervision. "You ready to head home?" he asked. "Yeah, I'm ready." They walked back to the wagon together, leaving Mercy House to its work and its residents. The drive home was quiet, comfortable, full of the easy silence that came from years of knowing someone completely. When they reached the ranch, Vivian paused before going inside, looking at the mountains one more time. "You know what I'm most grateful for?" she said. "What's that?" "That when I was at my absolute lowest, when I'd given up on everything except the desperate hope that somewhere might be better than Boston, I ended up here. In this place with you, building this life. I don't believe in fate or destiny or anything like that, but I believe in luck. And I got lucky the day that stagecoach brought me to Black Hollow." "I'm the one who got lucky," Garrett said. "You gave me a reason to care about tomorrow again. That's not nothing." Vivian smiled and took his hand. "Then maybe we both got lucky." They went inside together, into the home they'd made, and closed the door on the past and all its pain. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new moments of struggle and triumph. But for now, this moment, they had peace. And peace, hard won and carefully guarded, was everything.